Hey guys, tonight we journey into the world of medieval hygiene, a world that's sticky, noisy, and, well, never truly clean. As you ease back, picture yourself on a cobbled street in a city where the buildings lean in close and shadows stretch across the gutters. Someone shouts, "Gardyloo," and you step aside just in time to avoid a splash from above. The air is thick and damp, carrying 1,000 layered smells, herbs, animals, wood smoke, and something that definitely isn't bread baking. You wonder if you're prepared, but honestly you probably won't survive this era without a strong stomach or at least a clothespin for your nose. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, post your location and what time you're tuning in, so we can all be disgusted together in real time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along, careful not to let your shoes splash in puddles that aren't just rainwater. In medieval cities, chamber pots are a fact of life. You wake up in the cramped upper room of a crooked wooden house. The sun is barely up, but the city is already awake, creaking and groaning around you. Downstairs, someone shuffles to the window with a pot in hand. They shout a warning, sometimes just a lazy grunt, and out goes the night's business. Below, the street takes another hit. Good luck dodging that, if you're running late. That chamber pot, it's the medieval answer to indoor plumbing. Not so much an upgrade as an adaptation. Pots are made of clay, metal, sometimes even wood, if you're poor enough to risk a leak. After a night's use, they're emptied into the street, alley, or the open gutter running between rows of houses. Some places have slanted wooden chutes, like medieval water slides, but you get the idea. It isn't unusual for entire families to share a single pot. Hygiene. Not really a priority when your main goal is not to step in someone else's disaster before breakfast. There's a kind of rhythm to it all, an unspoken agreement that after dawn the streets belong to the early risers, the scavenging animals, and the bravest children, all dodging the results of last night's festivities. For sanitation workers, sometimes called rakers or gong farmers, this is the start of their shift. They move through the city with shovels and carts, scooping, hauling, and trying not to breathe too deeply. This job is low status, but weirdly, pretty well paid, since almost nobody else wants to do it. Sometimes you wonder if the townsfolk notice the smell, or if, after a while, your nose just gives up. There's a historical debate here. Did medieval people have a different sense of what clean meant? Some scholars argue that they just accepted the odors as part of life, while others say they made real efforts to manage them, using herbs, burning incense, or simply walking faster through the worst areas. Quirkier corners of the city bring quirkier customs. In London, there's a medieval tradition of night soil men. Yes, it's as pleasant as it sounds, who collected waste from cesspits and privies after dark, then carted it outside the city. Sometimes that waste ended up on fields as fertilizer. Sometimes it ended up exactly where it started, just a few blocks away. There's even a legend that some clever merchants sold barrels of night soil as garden compost. Buyer beware, right? Of course, chamber pots weren't just a city thing. In rural villages, you're just as likely to find a household with a shared bucket, emptied onto the midden heap behind the barn. The only real difference: more fresh air, more chickens poking around, and fewer neighbors to mind the mess. Fact is, medieval streets were designed with drainage in mind, at least that was the idea. Cities sloped toward central gutters, which in theory would flush away the waste with rainwater. In practice, on a dry day you get sticky alleys, puddles full of surprises, and a breeding ground for all sorts of things you'd rather not think about at bedtime. You glance up at a carved gargoyle perched above a doorway. Maybe it's watching over you, maybe it's just waiting for the next load from above. Either way, you move carefully, picking your path through a world where every step is a gamble. As the morning crowd grows, you notice that people walk with their eyes down, almost meditative, alert to any sudden movement overhead. There's even a bit of slapstick, kids daring each other to dash through danger zones, market sellers laughing as someone gets a wet surprise. Maybe humor is the best defense. You can't help but think, if hand sanitizer existed here, it would be more precious than gold. Historians still argue about just how bad it really was. Did medieval people wash more often than we think? Did they mind the smells, or did it all become invisible after a while? No matter who's right, you realize that surviving these streets means learning to dodge, laugh, and maybe breathe through your sleeve. And just when you think you've got the rhythm of this medieval morning down, you remember what goes out the window eventually comes back, in rain, in dust, in the food you buy from street vendors. Suddenly, you understand why so many old recipes call for boiling everything. The city wakes up, and so do you. Ready for a day where honestly, the only guarantee is that you'll need a good scrub, if you can find one. You press on, careful where you plant your feet, dodging puddles of uncertain origin, as the city stirs awake. The morning air isn't crisp so much as layered, every inhalation reminding you that fresh is a relative term. What you really want is water, clean, clear, straight from the earth. But in the medieval world, that's a luxury so rare you might as well be asking for bottled unicorn tears. You head for the nearest public well, drawn by the splash of buckets and the low murmur of neighbors. In a city this size, wells are gathering places, but they're also battlegrounds. The water isn't always what you'd call drinkable. Contamination is the silent guest at every meal, lurking in every cup. Wells are dug where they can be, sometimes far too close to cesspits and animal enclosures. On the best days you haul up cool, slightly metallic water. On the worst days, the surface shimmers with things you'd rather not identify. Water is precious, but it's also dangerous. You overhear two women bickering in line. One claims the well is cursed, the other insists it's just bad luck that her family keeps falling ill. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the connection between dirty water and disease. Some say they noticed patterns, certain wells made people sick, so they were avoided or even closed by decree. Others claim it was more superstition than science, with folks blaming evil spirits or angry saints. So what do you drink? Ale, mostly. Weak, lightly fermented small beer is safer than water and fills you up, so children and adults alike gulp it down all day. You trade hydration for a steady, gentle buzz. It's not a bad deal, unless you're the rare soul who can't tolerate alcohol. Even monks, supposedly the cleanest living of all, brew beer for the whole community. Sometimes it's thin as soup, sometimes it's strong enough to send you back to bed. But you're not always near a well or a brewery. Rivers flow through every great medieval city, glittering in the morning light. But you only have to get close to realize that what glitters isn't gold. People wash clothes, animals and themselves in these waters, sometimes only feet away from where tanners soak hides and butchers dump waste. You dip your fingers, then change your mind, wiping them dry on your cloak and trying not to look at the floating bits drifting downstream. If you're wealthy, you might have your own private well. You send a servant to fetch water, and you trust, sort of, that it's less polluted than what the masses get. Peasants in the countryside make do with springs, which are usually cleaner, but even then, a stray animal or unlucky thunderstorm can ruin a whole season's worth of good water. There's a kind of communal fatalism to it all. You watch as people bless themselves before drinking, offer a quick prayer, or even toss a coin into the well for luck. The water tastes of stone and soil, sometimes of iron, sometimes of nothing at all, which is the best you can hope for. On special days, if you're feeling brave, you add a sprig of mint or a squeeze of sour berry, hoping to mask whatever the water's hiding. A quirky side note, in some towns, water carriers are a real profession. These are burly, practical souls who haul huge barrels of water from one end of the city to the other, filling jugs for those who can afford the service. You see one now, muscles straining as he lugs his load, sweat already trickling down his face, even though it's barely noon. His secret: he never drinks from his own barrels. Bathing is a risky business too. When water is scarce or suspect, full-body immersion becomes a rare treat, saved for holidays, weddings, or desperate attempts to impress visitors. You start to understand why so many people douse themselves in perfume or keep sprigs of rosemary pinned to their clothes. If you can't get clean, you might as well try to smell like something else. Still, there's ingenuity here. You overhear an old woman explaining her method: let the water settle, then pour off the top. The bottom's always mud. Maybe she's on to something. Maybe everyone's just making it up as they go along. Mainstream history tells us that most people in medieval Europe avoided water when they could. Not just because it was dirty, but because they believed it could make you sick, weaken your body, or throw your humors out of balance. Medical treatises written in learned Latin warn against excessive wetness. Some even claim that water, if taken at the wrong hour, can steal your very soul. Is that science? Is it ritual? Historians still argue the point. So you sip your ale, eye the well warily, and try not to think about what's floating in the cup. Maybe tomorrow you'll try the cider, or maybe you'll stick to broth. Either way, you realize, thirst is a problem nobody in this city has really solved. You wander off, not quite refreshed, and find yourself wondering, what's next on your medieval hygiene tour? Spoiler, it's only getting weirder. You meander through the tangled back streets, following a faint haze of steam and laughter to the neighborhood bathhouse. It's not as exclusive as a private tub. Very few people in this world can afford that sort of luxury, but it's as close as you'll get to clean on a regular basis. The sign outside promises relaxation and renewal, though the look on the attendant's face says, "Leave your dignity at the door." You step inside, ducking beneath timber beams, your senses hit by a cocktail of scents: boiling herbs, mildew, cheap perfume, and something slightly sweet that you can't quite place. Maybe it's the last person's attempt at hygiene. Inside, the room swirls with activity. You're surrounded by townsfolk, nobles wrapped in linen, apprentices with mud on their boots, a couple of boisterous merchants arguing about whose turn it is for the biggest tub. Everyone's here, from babies to the very old, and you realize this isn't just about scrubbing off the day's dirt. It's social, noisy, and oddly comforting, sort of like a medieval version of the local coffee shop. If coffee shops had buckets of cold water and a communal loofah. Mainstream history likes to point out that medieval Europeans weren't entirely averse to bathing, at least not early on. In fact, public bathhouses flourished in cities like London, Paris, and Prague, sometimes with separate hours for men and women, sometimes not. You wade into the warm water and catch a glimpse of yourself in a clouded mirror. There's a certain satisfaction to it, soaking, sweating, and if you're lucky, not catching something that'll send you straight to the apothecary. Of course there's a catch. Most bathhouses double as community gathering spots, places for gossip, a little gambling, and in some quarters, services not covered by your average spa. The term stew gets tossed around. Some say it refers to the clouds of steam, others to the mix of people and activities inside. As you recline, you overhear someone mention that the city council is thinking of shutting the place down, worried it spreads disease more than health. Historians still argue about whether bathhouses truly contributed to the spread of plague, or were just unlucky scapegoats. Either way, you feel a twinge of doubt as you glance at the discolored ceiling, and the mold creeping up the walls. There's a quirky fringe side to these places too. In some bathhouses, you'd find attendants offering odd spa treatments, from exfoliating with rough cloths to pouring heated wine over your skin, for a fee of course. Some claim a good scrubbing can cure just about anything: headaches, heartbreak, even taxes. You spot a local character who swears by rubbing goose fat on sore joints, though the rest of the room gives him a wide berth. Not all bathhouses are created equal. The richer the neighborhood, the more likely you are to find hot water, clean towels, and maybe a pinch of rose petals floating on the surface. For everyone else, there's a good chance you'll end up sharing bath water with half the block. It's like one of those awkward hot tub parties, except you're less worried about conversation and more about who last rinsed their feet. You do your best to relax, making a mental note to keep your mouth shut and your eyes averted. You watch as two friends pour buckets of cold water over their heads, shivering and laughing. Another man, possibly the local barber, offers haircuts and tooth-pulling between rounds of scrubbing. You briefly wonder if his tools ever get washed. Best not to ask. As the afternoon wanes, the steam thickens and the temperature dips. Some bathhouses burn aromatic woods to mask the less pleasant smells. Others hang dried lavender or rosemary from the rafters, though you can still detect the underlying notes of wet wool and old soap. You try to remember the last time your own clothes felt truly clean. A bath isn't always about dirt either. In some medieval cities, bathhouses function as semi-legal date spots, and it's not unusual to see couples slip away behind a curtain. There are laws against immoral behavior in the stews, but those laws are only as strong as the guy collecting bribes at the front door. Every so often the authorities crack down, usually right after a new outbreak of illness. The cycle continues, like a lather you can't quite rinse away. You finish your soak, feeling cleaner, but not entirely convinced. Maybe you've picked up more than you left behind. Historians keep debating, did the popularity of bathhouses wax and wane with each plague, or did people just get used to living with the risk? Either way, you know you'll be back. Because in a world where chamber pots rain from the sky, and the city's water is suspect, a hot bath, even a questionable one, feels like a little miracle. You towel off, nod at the next hopeful bather, and head back into the city's wild aromatic embrace. As the bathhouse fades behind you, you're reminded that sometimes, getting clean in the medieval world meant just feeling a little less filthy for an hour or two, and sometimes, that's enough. You step out of the bathhouse, blinking in the dimming light of the afternoon. The city seems to hold its breath, still buzzing, but more quietly now. As you walk, you notice the people around you, all wrapped in woolen layers, their faces flushed from the heat and the day's business, seem perfectly content with the world as it is. And yet, you can't help but notice something unsettling about the air, the smell of sweat, soot, animals and worse. It's a reminder that in this medieval world, cleanliness is not a given. It's a luxury that few can afford, even if they're willing to pay for it. The streets are lined with open-air markets, but today, you're less interested in the bustling haggling for vegetables, or the piles of freshly butchered meat. No, today, your focus is on something much less appetizing. You weave through the stalls, past merchants hawking their wares, towards one of the less glamorous corners of the city. Welcome to the world of body odors, hygiene habits, and the fascinatingly grim ways that medieval folks dealt with their dirty business. The first thing you'll notice is that, unlike the modern world, deodorant isn't even a concept, not even close. In this world, a person's smell is simply part of them. It's a mix of body odors, dust, food and, especially in the summer, everything that's been absorbed into their clothes. Laundry, when it happens, is an event. Most people have one or two changes of clothing, which means that what's worn every day is the same thing you slept in, worked in, and sweat in. Now let's talk about the clothes themselves. You remember that linen tunic you slipped into earlier. Let's be honest, it's already soaked through with sweat, and it doesn't have the advantage of modern breathable fabric. Wool and linen were the main choices back then, and neither was particularly good at keeping things fresh. The worst part, neither material could handle much in the way of cleaning. Washing clothes was done rarely and often only when absolutely necessary, and even then, it was usually done with harsh soap or full-on scalding water. And after all that, it still didn't smell fresh. You see, in the medieval world, people didn't really have the luxury of changing clothes every day. They wore the same set for weeks, maybe months, until it was so tattered that they could finally be tossed out or repaired. Sure, the wealthy had multiple sets of clothing, at least enough to make sure they didn't smell quite as bad, but the poor, they just had to make do. The smell of body odor, sweat and grime simply clung to everyone, no matter their station. But let's pause for a moment and consider something a little stranger. In medieval Europe, perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was essential. Nobles, merchants, and anyone with a little extra money spent hours every day applying strong scents to mask the fact that they were often not quite as clean as we imagine royalty to be. Some relied on a strong mix of herbs, while others splurged on scents made from the oils of flowers, like rose or lavender. The richer you were, the more complex the scents you could afford. Lavender, roses and rosemary were the staples, but the truly wealthy sometimes indulged in spices, or even animal-based perfumes, including the incredibly expensive and pungent ambergris. At the same time, the less fortunate had to make do with whatever they could scrape together. Most commoners turned to herbs they grew themselves, mint, thyme, or a handful of rosemary. The poor might also rely on a little something that seems almost laughable today: dung. That's right, the same stuff that might have been sloshing down the streets could sometimes be repurposed in the name of hygiene. Animal dung, mixed with herbs, was sometimes spread on the body to create a makeshift deodorant. No one said it worked well, but at least it was cheap. In all of this, one thing becomes clear. Hygiene in the medieval period wasn't about being clean in the sense we understand it today. It was about masking the unavoidable smell of human life. Every corner of every town, every marketplace, every noble's hall, and every peasant's hut had its own specific stench. The smell of life, death, animals, and human sweat intermingled, forming an invisible cloud that hovered over the entire world. You stopped for a moment to watch a street vendor expertly apply a dusting of rose powder on his face, a touch of dignity among the grime. Next to him, a poor woman runs her fingers through her hair, brushing the lice away, and then pushing through the dense crowd. For her, scent is an afterthought, and cleanliness might come only when the seasons change, or when she's lucky enough to find a public bathhouse. For the wealthier, they'll dab a little rose water, or sprinkle themselves with fragrant oils to cover what can't be avoided. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed in the power of perfume, or if it was simply a necessary evil, a way to make social interactions bearable. Was it a status symbol, or was it the equivalent of modern air fresheners, a distraction from the stench of life? Nobody really knows, but one thing is certain: a little spritz could make the difference between a polite conversation and a nose-wrinkling silence. So, as you make your way through the city streets, where everyone and everything is covered in a layer of dust, sweat and perfume, you realize just how much the medieval world accepted what we'd find utterly unbearable. It's a place where odor isn't just a byproduct of life, it's a fact of it. You wonder, in a world where cleanliness is so out of reach, how long before you start to accept the stink yourself. The sun sets slowly, casting long shadows across the streets, as you wander deeper into the heart of the medieval city. The shops are closing, the market stalls packing up, but the lingering smells of the day hang in the air. Charred meat, fresh fish, fruit rotting on the edges of the marketplace, and a heavy dose of human sweat. As you walk, you find yourself slipping past crowds, dodging the unspoken contest of who can tolerate the most pungent air. For the next part of your journey, you need to head toward the areas that most people avoid. The alleyways, the darkest corners of the city, where you'll find the relics of medieval hygiene in their most practical and uncomfortable forms. You're heading toward what we'd call privies or latrines, but in this world, they're more than just toilets. They're an unfortunate fact of life, a grim necessity that keeps the city from falling apart. There are no sewers here, no modern plumbing to carry waste away. What you have instead are rows of public privies, each one serving its specific function, and none of them particularly pleasant. You approach the first of these communal latrines, tucked behind a large stone building. A foul smell wafts from beneath the door, and you can hear the clatter of buckets and the scrape of stone as workers prepare the site for the next round of waste disposal. These aren't the sleek, clean restrooms we know today, far from it.
In fact, some of them are little more than pits dug into the ground, often directly beneath the buildings. Others are sitting privies, designed with a series of holes in a long wooden bench, where people can well do their business side by side. It's communal, public, and often shared by dozens of people, which is exactly why it stinks so badly. No amount of rosemary or rose water can cover that up. As you step inside one of these privies, it's clear just how little privacy medieval people had when it came to such matters. Men, women and children alike all used the same latrines, though in some places, the rich had private areas for their use, while the poor made do with whatever was available. You sit on the cold stone, and the floor beneath your feet is slick with waste. The smell is overpowering, but there's an odd comfort in knowing that you're not the only one who has to suffer through it. You shift, trying to avoid stepping into the muck that covers the floor, and take a moment to reflect on how these latrines functioned. Public latrines were a place of great social interaction. It wasn't uncommon for people to gather at the privies, gossiping, and even making deals while they took care of business. Some folks even kept spare coin in a pocket, ready to pay the lavatory attendants for cleaning the seats and keeping the place somewhat functional. What was once a simple solitary act became something like a public event, complete with laughter, complaints, and the occasional argument about who left the worst mess behind. Historians still argue over how often people in medieval cities used latrines. Some believe that waste was disposed of only when it became unbearable, while others argue that public privies were visited more frequently than we'd expect. Either way, one thing is certain: waste management in the medieval world was as much about community as it was about convenience. And then there's the question of disposal. What happens to all that waste? Once it's done its duty, it's either carted off to a nearby field to fertilize crops, or in some cases simply dumped into a river. In some cities, a form of early sewage system was in place, where waste would be diverted into large pits or trenches, often near rivers, where it would disappear into the current. In more rural areas, waste might be buried, but in the worst-case scenarios, people would simply toss their chamber pots out of the window into the street. As you leave the privy behind and head back toward the city centre, you can't help but marvel at how medieval people lived with their waste. In a world that's dominated by smells, sickness, and overflowing latrines, they still managed to build entire civilizations. You're almost impressed by their resilience, their ability to endure the discomforts and downright revolting realities of life. And yet, there's no escaping the fact that you too will have to live with it. You'll have to navigate the waste, the filth, and the pungent air just as everyone else does.
You pass by a group of merchants packing up for the night, their carts filled with the remnants of their goods. There's a certain camaraderie among the city dwellers tonight, a shared understanding that no matter how bad things may get, there's always tomorrow to wash away some of the grime. Even if they don't know it yet, the world is changing slowly, and one day the idea of shared latrines and chamber pots in every home will be a distant memory. But not today. Not yet. Historians still argue about how medieval people lived in these conditions, and what, exactly, they knew about disease. Some claim that they didn't understand the link between filth and sickness, while others suggest that they had a rough idea but didn't have the technology to act on it. Either way, the medieval world's hygiene was a delicate balancing act, a dance between dirt, disease, and survival. You head back into the city, breathing in the smells of a world you'll never fully understand, but one that will stick with you, just like the scent of the streets. As night falls over the medieval city, the atmosphere shifts. The last few rays of sunlight slip away, but the smell lingers, unmistakable, unyielding. Your feet crunch over the cobblestones, each step echoing in the quiet. It's been a long day, and you've seen some of the worst and weirdest parts of medieval hygiene. But there's more, much more. And as you wander through these narrow, dimly lit streets, you can't help but feel that you're stepping into a different world entirely. A world where cleanliness is a distant dream, and the battle for survival continues in strange, unexpected ways. Tonight you're headed for a different corner of the city, a quieter, more isolated part, where the rich live behind high walls and gates. Here the practices may seem more refined, but even the wealthiest medieval households had their share of peculiar hygiene rituals. Their cleanliness was still built on the same basic principles, the use of whatever materials were available, a healthy dose of superstition, and of course a touch of crude humor. You arrive at the entrance of a noble manor. The walls are thick, the gate heavy, and the house within is a testament to wealth and power, albeit one that's perhaps a little too intimate. Behind closed doors, the nobles lived with their own set of hygiene challenges. They had access to the finest clothes, imported perfumes, and the best of everything that money could buy. But there were still limits to what their riches could provide. The manor's servants, those poor souls, were in charge of cleaning the elaborate tapestries and sweeping the large halls, but cleaning their masters. That was another story altogether. Inside, the smell of beeswax candles and fresh linen fills the air, a temporary relief from the smell of the streets outside. You can't help but notice the grand baths, though baths might be an overstatement. Some nobles had large wooden tubs where they would sit and soak, but these were a luxury not everyone could afford, and not every day was a bath day. The tub would be filled with water, either heated on a stove or brought in from a nearby well, and often it was shared by the entire family. Yes, shared. The idea of individual baths was far too extravagant for the majority, and so the rich would scrub themselves down, passing the water from person to person, rinsing away the day's grime. It wasn't so much about comfort as it was about getting by, making sure that the appearance of cleanliness was maintained. And of course it wasn't long before the water was unrecognizable, murky with the remnants of soap, sweat, and skin. The rich might have access to the best materials, but that didn't necessarily mean they were free from lice, fleas, or other pests that took up residence in the creases of their clothing and beds. Lice weren't discriminating. Whether you lived in a castle or a humble cottage, you were at risk. Even the nobles had to contend with these tiny invaders, and it wasn't uncommon to see an aristocrat scratching at his scalp in public, trying to maintain his composure. Some women in particular went to extreme lengths to rid themselves of these pests, using sulfur, herbs, or even oils to treat their hair. Others resorted to drastic measures, like shaving their heads completely. Some historians argue that the elaborate hairstyles of noble women, especially in the later medieval period, were not only for fashion, but also served as a way to hide the damage caused by lice. And then there's the issue of their personal hygiene routines, specifically their teeth. You notice an elderly noblewoman in the corner of the room, nervously running her fingers along her jawline. She looks as if she might have something to say, but it's hard to focus when your mind is drawn to the small wooden box she carries with her. It's filled with strange powders, mixtures that were supposed to help with dental care, though they were rarely effective. Instead, most nobles relied on rinsing their mouths with wine or vinegar, hoping to mask the odor and the decay that inevitably followed. A toothbrush. Forget it. The toothbrush, as we know it, wouldn't be invented for centuries. In the meantime, they made do with rudimentary tools, chew sticks, twigs, and abrasive powders, all in the name of fighting bad breath and cavities. Historians still argue about how many of these rituals actually worked. But one thing is clear: medieval dental hygiene was a game of trial and error. Not everyone lived in luxury, of course. The majority of the population, peasants, tradespeople, and lower-class workers, had a very different approach to hygiene. Bathing was a rare event, and when it did happen, it often involved the use of cold water, occasionally boiled with herbs. The water was shared by the whole family, making it more of a group activity than a personal indulgence. Towels, if they had them, were often nothing more than rough cloths, far from the fluffy towels we're used to today. And washing your hair? Not often. Most people went months without washing their hair, instead opting for the occasional rinse with cold water and herbs. The poor had little access to soap, and what they used was often homemade and made from animal fat. It's easy to imagine how it must have felt for them. Sweating in the summer, shivering in the winter, always struggling to stay one step ahead of the dirt and grime that accumulated. For them, hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about survival. In an era without antibiotics or modern medicine, cleanliness often meant the difference between life and death. Infection, disease and lice were constant threats. And yet they pressed on, relying on rudimentary remedies and the faint hope that they would make it through another season without succumbing to illness. Historians still argue whether medieval people were fully aware of the link between hygiene and health. It's possible that many did, but couldn't do much about it. Or maybe they simply accepted it as part of life. Either way, one thing remains certain: medieval hygiene was messy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright unthinkable. As the night grows darker, and the city's streets quiet down, you're left reflecting on the world you've just walked through. A world where cleanliness was a luxury few could afford, and hygiene practices were more about survival than comfort. It's a strange, uncomfortable thought, but it's part of the story. The medieval world was messy, chaotic, and full of contradictions, but in a strange way it worked. For better or worse, it was their reality. The night air has cooled now, and the last flickering flames of lanterns cast long dancing shadows on the cobbled streets. You stroll through the quieter lanes, where the echo of laughter and haggling from the market fades into a soft murmur. There's a strange haunting peace in the air tonight, and the further you walk, the more you realize just how pervasive the idea of hygiene is in the medieval world, not because it's clean, but because it's deeply, often grotesquely, personal. And as you find your way into a quieter neighborhood, you're reminded that for some, hygiene wasn't just about being physically clean, it was about a battle for status, reputation, and survival. This brings you to a fascinating contradiction: the world of luxury hygiene. The richer you were, the more elaborate your cleaning rituals became. Nobles, as you've learned, could afford grand wooden tubs, imported fragrances, and perfumed oils. But there was one thing they couldn't escape: their hygiene habits were often as public as they were private. They lived in a world where appearances meant everything. And if you were a noble woman, for example, your cleanliness wasn't just a matter of health, it was your status symbol. You enter the grand estate of a wealthy merchant, a place where cleanliness, or the appearance of it, was a constant preoccupation. Here hygiene was as much about social prestige as it was about practicalities. The rich would fill their expansive baths with scented oils and the water would be imported from clean sources, sometimes brought by carts or boats, fresh from wells and springs. In this world, even the way you bathed became an art form, slow, deliberate, and filled with intricate rituals. Water wasn't just for cleaning, it was a means of demonstrating wealth and sophistication. But even in these luxurious surroundings, things weren't as perfect as they appeared. You notice the cracks in the walls, the slightly mildewed scent in the corners of the room. That rich perfume, lavender, rose and citrus, can't quite mask the faint trace of something else beneath. You overhear a servant gossiping in a hushed voice about a nobleman who's just had his annual bath, an event that the whole house prepares for. And it's not just because he'll smell better. For this nobleman, bathing is a rare ritual, one that happens at best once or twice a year. Historians still argue whether people in the upper echelons of society had an understanding of hygiene, or if it was purely a social construct designed to keep up appearances. Some say the wealthy knew the dangers of neglecting cleanliness, but simply didn't have the means to bathe regularly. The rich weren't immune to disease, after all. You wonder whether these grand rituals were about masking the fact that they too were just as filthy as everyone else, but with a thicker layer of perfume. In the grand manner, the rich might bathe in luxury, but there's a common belief among scholars: hygiene, to them, was more of a symbolic act. The baths didn't wash away disease, they kept away the stigma of poverty and illness. It wasn't about cleanliness in the modern sense, it was about the performance of cleanliness. How do you demonstrate wealth if not by bathing in hot water that no peasant could dream of? As you slip through the hallways, you can't help but feel the tension between the grandiose display of luxury and the underlying rot. The world of noble hygiene isn't as clean as it pretends to be. But even with this knowledge, the rituals continue, elaborate, ever more elaborate. The real twist comes when you move away from the city's wealthier quarters and toward the more rural homes. In these houses, hygiene is more about necessity than appearance. Rural folk rarely have the luxury of a private bath or the means to buy soap. For them, cleanliness is a practical matter. People make do with what they can find, washing in rivers, lakes and any fresh water they can access. They use herbs to cleanse, and sometimes even mud. Yes, mud. It sounds absurd, but in the medieval world, certain muds were believed to have healing properties, absorbing oil, sweat and dirt with a single application. You pass by a humble cottage, where an old woman is sitting by the fire, rubbing her arms with a sticky brown paste. You step closer, intrigued, and she greets you with a warm smile. She explains in a thick accent that she's using clay from the river to cleanse her skin. Apparently, it's a well-known remedy among the locals, and it's said to draw out impurities. In some ways it's more effective than soap, she claims, as it takes the grime away. Historians still debate whether medieval people had the same awareness of hygiene as we do today. Some argue that they didn't, while others suggest that they had their own systems of cleaning that didn't involve modern methods. Either way, it's clear that for those outside of the noble courts, hygiene was a much simpler, more hands-on affair. The methods weren't always pleasant, but they were practical, and sometimes more effective than what the wealthy were doing inside their ornate bathhouses. It's strange to think that the upper classes, with all their wealth and access to resources, might have been just as dirty as those they looked down upon. The difference. The rich could afford to pretend, could afford to mask their dirt with perfume and oils. The poor, on the other hand, had no choice but to get creative, making do with what they had. In the end, medieval hygiene wasn't about being clean, it was about surviving, about doing the best with what you could find, and about holding on to some semblance of dignity in a world that often didn't allow it. As you step out of the manor, your mind reels from the contrast, the splendor of wealth and the grit of survival. You realize that in this world, hygiene isn't just a practice, it's a statement, a performance, and often a dangerous gamble. As the evening settles into a quiet, murmured hum, you slip back into the dark alleyways of the city, where things are always a little less refined, and a little more real. You're far from the opulent walls of the noble estates now. The light from the lanterns casts distorted shadows on the uneven cobblestones, as you pass by homes that barely stand, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of time. These are the houses of common folk, the ones who are still awake, still working, still surviving. You find yourself at a small gathering outside a humble cottage. The air here is thick, not just with the sounds of hushed conversation, but with the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and animal dung. The villagers are finishing up their day's work, tending to their animals, cleaning their modest homes, and preparing for what little rest they can get. But you notice something curious in the flickering light of the fire, a group of children, each carrying a handful of what looks like dried herbs and bundles of twigs. You approach, curious about what they're doing, and a young girl looks up with a grin, showing off her handful of herbs. For the lice, she says, almost proudly. We're making a wash with lavender and rosemary, keeps them out of our hair. It's a simple but vital part of life for the children of the lower classes, who may not have the luxury of soap or clean water, but do have access to the things that grow around them. The lavender, rosemary and mint that they collect will be boiled into a fragrant wash that will be used to clean their scalps and keep lice at bay. The notion of lice in medieval times is hardly a new one. In fact, it's as much a part of the medieval hygiene story as chamber pots and public latrines. Lice were an unavoidable fact of life for most people, rich and poor alike.
But for the wealthy, the battle against lice could sometimes be fought with luxury, special ointments, vinegar, or oils that could be massaged into the scalp. For the poor, it was herbs, water, and a daily ritual of combing through hair. The battle for cleanliness was fought on the heads of millions of medieval people, who often resorted to a delicate dance of prevention and treatment, with little more than their own resourcefulness to rely on. Historians still argue about how much people truly understood the danger of lice and other pests. Some believe that medieval folk saw lice and fleas as simple, unavoidable nuisances of life, while others suggest that they understood the connection between poor hygiene and illness. Either way, there was no escaping them. For the common folk, lice were not just uncomfortable, they were a constant presence, so deeply ingrained in daily life, that it almost seemed as though you were never quite free of them. You imagine that these children, young as they are, know that even if they scrubbed for hours, they'd still face the threat of those little invaders. The interesting thing about lice, however, is that they weren't just a sign of dirt, they were often a sign of survival. In a world where bathing was infrequent, and laundry was a rare luxury, having lice was simply a part of life. In fact, some scholars argue that lice weren't as much of a health hazard as we often think today. People may have known they were uncomfortable, but they didn't necessarily associate them with the spread of disease. Lice were just part of the human experience, one more thing you learned to live with. But let's shift our focus. As the children prepare their herbal wash and laugh among themselves, you spot something more, a small group of villagers, all gathered around a fire, preparing to sleep. And this isn't your typical medieval scene. These people have just finished a day of hard labor, and you can see the toll it's taken on them. They're tired, but not entirely exhausted. They don't have the luxury of long baths or fine clothes, but they do have something that no noble could buy. Community. In medieval society, cleanliness wasn't just a private affair, it was a social one. You couldn't just close your door, take a bath, and forget about the world. Instead, everything was shared. Lice were shared, sickness was shared. And sometimes, even in a world where hygiene was a luxury few could afford, the one thing that held it all together was the knowledge that you weren't alone in the struggle. There's something strangely comforting in the realization that everyone, rich or poor, had their own version of hygiene. The wealthy had access to perfumes and baths, but that didn't mean they were cleaner. The poor had access to herbs and a routine of combing, but that didn't mean they were any less human. They simply made do, each in their own way. It was about survival, about community, about doing what you could with what little you had. You sit with the group around the fire, the warmth of the flames mingling with the cool night air. The smell of herbs, wood smoke and sweat fills the air. You realize that for all the discomforts of medieval hygiene, it wasn't so different from our own. Sure, they didn't have modern conveniences, but in their own way, they were just as concerned with cleanliness as we are today. The methods may have been different, but the need to feel clean, to wash away the grime of the day, was universal. Historians still argue about how much medieval people truly cared about cleanliness. Some say they were unaware of the germs and diseases that swirled around them, while others argue they were more aware than we give them credit for. Either way, they made do. And in the end, perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can learn from their world. Sometimes, it's not about being perfectly clean. It's about doing the best you can with what you've got. The night deepens, and the fire crackles. You drift into a peaceful silence, reflecting on the strange unspoken truths of the medieval world. In a time where cleanliness was far from guaranteed, it was community, resourcefulness, and survival that mattered most. The moon has risen now, casting its silvery glow over the city. The streets are quieter than before, the usual hustle of the day fading into the stillness of the night. Yet, as you wander through the narrow alleys, past the rowdy taverns and closed-up market stalls, one thing becomes abundantly clear. This medieval world, despite its smell and discomfort, is deeply invested in one thing above all: survival. You find yourself standing before a row of simple cottages, where the last flickers of light show people finishing their evening rituals. It's late, and they're preparing for bed, but there's something else going on here that you can't ignore. The incredible ways that medieval people managed to live in what for many seems like a world of perpetual dirt. Life in these communities was not just about surviving the elements, it was about managing hygiene in the most basic, resourceful ways. As you walk through the quiet village, you see several women gathering around a fire. The warmth from the flames dances in their eyes as they boil pots of water, preparing a wash for themselves and their families. They're not preparing for a full bath, as that would be a luxury. Instead, they're wiping their faces with damp rags, scrubbing their arms, their legs, and even their feet. This is the ritual of the poor, the routine that survived centuries of tradition, cleaning up in the simplest way possible. There's a comforting rhythm to their movements, a well-practiced art of washing where water is precious and soap is rare. These women don't have time to worry about elaborate baths or expensive perfumes. They don't need them. Their cleanliness comes from the way they've adapted, using what nature has provided them. Sometimes, they use rosemary, thyme, or sage plants that grow freely around them. Other times, they boil berries into a paste, which will help soften their skin. Historians still debate how much medieval people understood about hygiene and health, but one thing is certain: they had practical knowledge about the things that mattered. These women might not have had the luxury of baths or perfumes, but they knew how to clean their skin with nature's tools. They knew how to fight lice with herbs and essential oils, and they knew how to preserve their dignity in a world where cleanliness often seemed out of reach. As you watch them work, you begin to realize just how much effort goes into the small everyday practices that keep people from feeling utterly defeated by the dirt. This is their survival strategy, a strategy based not on modern hygiene standards, but on a practical, hands-on approach to keeping clean. Theirs is a world of improvisation, of making do with what's available, of turning the necessity of cleaning into an art form. After they finish, one of the women offers you a seat by the fire. She hands you a small bundle of herbs, rosemary, mint and lavender, carefully tied together with twine. She gestures toward the fire, indicating that you should hold the bundle over the flame for a few moments. It's a cleansing ritual, she explains, designed to freshen the air and keep away unwanted pests. We make do with what we have, she says with a smile, her voice soft yet filled with determination. It's not much, but it works. You watch the smoke curl upward, the scent of the herbs mingling with the night air. There's something deeply calming about the simplicity of it. You think about the wealthy people you saw earlier, those who had access to expensive perfumes, fancy baths and private latrines. In some ways, they had the luxury of cleanliness, but it was also a status symbol, an outward sign of wealth. These women, on the other hand, are concerned with something else entirely: the reality of living in a world where the most basic aspects of hygiene are a daily struggle. They don't need status symbols, they need solutions, and in a world that often makes do with what's available, that's exactly what they have. You walk away from the fire, feeling strangely humbled by the ritual you've just witnessed. There's no room for pretense here, no room for the luxurious scents and elaborate displays of cleanliness that the wealthy can afford. This is a different kind of hygiene, one that comes from necessity and ingenuity rather than social status. As you make your way back toward the center of the city, you can't help but think about the vast gap between the rich and the poor, the ones who can bathe in luxury, and the ones who must scrape together whatever they can to survive. The city seems different now. The smells, the sounds, and even the sights of the streets feel more poignant. You realize that in this medieval world, hygiene wasn't about being perfect. It was about surviving in a world that wasn't kind to the clean. Whether you were wealthy or poor, there was always a fight against dirt, against pests, and against the grime of the world. The only difference was how you fought that fight. Historians still argue about the evolution of hygiene, about whether medieval people knew what they were doing, or if they were simply resigned to their fate. Some believe they understood more than we give them credit for, while others argue that they were simply making do with what little they had. Either way, the point remains the same. The medieval world was full of dirt, disease and discomfort, but it was also full of resilience, creativity, and the will to survive. It was a world where cleanliness was as much about community and shared struggle as it was about individual effort. And in that struggle, people found their way to a kind of survival that was in its own way as sophisticated as any modern hygiene. As the night wears on, the city begins to quiet. The sounds of distant conversation and the occasional clink of metal fade into a soft hum. It's peaceful here, despite the lingering odor in you find yourself contemplating the world you've wandered through, the grimy alleys, the perfumed halls, the crude latrines, and the grandiose rituals. It's as though medieval hygiene existed in a realm of contradictions. The poor had their resourceful methods, the rich had their elaborate appearances, and somewhere between it all, survival was the common thread. You find yourself walking toward the outskirts of the city now, the streets emptier, the buildings more spread out. Ahead, a small, somewhat isolated village sits beneath the glow of the moon. It's quiet here, the kind of stillness that feels almost out of place. You're drawn in by the faint glow of a small cottage, its windows aglow with flickering candlelight. This is the world of rural hygiene, where the simple art of washing and cleaning has to be done on the fly, without the benefit of the modern luxuries the city dwellers take for granted. Here, practicality rules, not status. At the door of the cottage stands a woman, her hands busy with a pile of freshly washed laundry. The linen looks rough and stiff, far from the soft fabrics of the wealthy, but it's clean. Cleaner than you might expect. She glances up as you approach, a friendly smile crossing her face. "You're welcome to come in," she says, her voice kind but direct. She's used to the casual intrusion of visitors, and it's clear she doesn't mind the company.
As you step inside, you notice the warmth of the room. A fire crackles in the hearth, filling the space with the comforting smell of burning wood, but it's the floor that catches your attention. It's covered in straw, a simple but effective way to keep the dirt and grime of the outside world from making its way into the living space. This is medieval hygiene at its most basic. The floor is clean enough for bare feet, but only because the straw is regularly changed and replaced. The woman points to a small wooden bucket by the door. "That's where we wash up," she explains. Nothing fancy, but it works. We don't have the luxury of public bathhouses or fresh running water like in the city. The bucket is filled with water from the well, which is some distance away. For her, the act of washing isn't just about getting clean. It's a necessity, a part of daily life that requires effort and time. You watch as she dips a cloth into the water, wringing it out before wiping her face and neck. It's a humbling sight. This simple, effective approach to hygiene. No perfumes, no elaborate rituals, just water, soap if they have it, and the ability to scrub away the day's dirt. There's no luxury here, no pretense. Hygiene is about practicality, about surviving in a world where water is precious, soap is a luxury, and cleanliness is more about survival than comfort. Historians still debate the role of cleanliness in rural medieval life. Some suggest that the rural poor were much cleaner than we give them credit for, that their reliance on simple natural remedies was effective in ways that we don't understand today. Others argue that their hygiene practices were just as inadequate as those of the city's poor, and that disease and infection were a constant threat. Either way, you realize that in this world hygiene isn't a luxury, it's a way of life. And in a place like this, it's a survival strategy that has been honed over generations. You sit by the fire for a while, watching the woman as she continues her routine, and you reflect on everything you've learned. The medieval world wasn't clean in the way we understand it today. There were no antiseptics, no modern plumbing, and no understanding of germs or hygiene. But that doesn't mean people didn't try. They found ways to deal with dirt, disease, and discomfort in the best ways they could, given the resources at hand. And in that simplicity, there's something strangely beautiful. There's an honesty to the struggle for cleanliness, an acceptance that hygiene in the medieval world wasn't about perfection. It was about doing what you could, with what you had, to stay healthy and stay alive. And while modern hygiene practices might be easier, faster, and more effective, there's something that feels deeply real about the way the medieval world fought the same battles, just with a different set of tools. As you leave the cottage, the woman waves goodbye, her hand still busy with her work. You take one last look at the peaceful scene before you head back toward the bustling city. The stark contrast between the two worlds is impossible to ignore. The city, with its public bathhouses, lavish perfumes, and complex social rituals surrounding cleanliness, seems so far removed from the simplicity of the rural life you've just witnessed. And yet both worlds are bound by the same reality, the never-ending need to manage the dirt and disease that come with living in a human body. As you walk back through the city, you can't help but think of the delicate balance that existed between dirt and cleanliness, survival and luxury. In the medieval world, hygiene was never just about soap and water. It was about making do, about adjusting your expectations, and about finding ways to stay healthy in a world that didn't care about your comfort. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood hygiene, but one thing is clear: they knew how to survive. Whether they bathed in perfume or in a bucket of water, whether they scrubbed their faces with herbs or suffered through the daily discomfort of lice, they adapted, and in that adaptation they showed just how resilient they were. The night deepens as you continue through the medieval streets, each step carrying you further into the web of this world where hygiene is an afterthought for some, a luxury for others, and a matter of survival for many. You can feel the rhythm of the city settling in around you, as if the streets themselves are breathing in sync with the thoughts you're chasing. There's a lingering weight to it, a presence that won't quite let go. The medieval world, after all, was built on both the resilience of its people and the inherent messiness of their existence. You find yourself now standing near the edge of a grand church, its towering stone walls casting long shadows across the courtyard. The evening bell tolls, echoing through the city. This is a place of reverence, of rituals, but also one where the concepts of cleanliness and purification are twisted with religion. You glance around, and it's clear that this sacred space, for all its grandeur, is also tied deeply to the complex and often unsettling rituals of hygiene. Monks and nuns lived in monasteries where cleanliness took on a different form. It wasn't just about getting rid of dirt, it was about purifying the soul. Bathing for many was seen as indulgence, even excess. In fact, some religious orders believed that bathing could lead to vanity or lust, so many monks and nuns refrained from washing their bodies, choosing instead to cleanse their spirits through prayer and penance. The concept of spiritual cleanliness was far more important than the physical kind. You can't help but wonder how they reconciled the idea of purity with the fact that they likely smelled worse than the average peasant who took their bath every month or so. As you walk past the high walls of the church, you can hear the faint murmur of voices from inside, the faithful gathered for Vespers. You're reminded that in the medieval world, cleanliness wasn't just about physical hygiene, it was about the state of your soul. And so for many it was considered more virtuous to endure discomfort, including the discomfort of filth, rather than to indulge in the luxury of cleanliness. There's something deeply ingrained in this belief, a puritanical sense that suffering was a necessary path to spiritual salvation. Historians still debate whether these religious practices were a result of medieval asceticism or just practical measures in the absence of modern hygiene knowledge. Whether religious orders truly committed to purity through suffering, or did they simply not have the resources to maintain cleanliness? Either way, the concept of holy dirtiness became a staple in the lives of those who lived in the cloisters and monastic retreats. And as you watch the monks walk in and out of the church, their simple robes falling around them like faded curtains, you can't help but wonder how much of their discomfort was voluntary, and how much of it was just a reflection of the times they lived in. For the rest of the city, though, the situation was a little less noble. Most people lived in a world where personal hygiene was directly tied to survival, not spirituality. It's here in the bustling lower city that you get a real sense of how hygiene is managed. People who couldn't afford the luxury of perfumes, oils, or regular baths simply had to make do with what was at hand. For them, hygiene wasn't a matter of pride, it was a matter of health. At the local market, you watch a butcher scrub his hands with water and a little soap, if you can call it soap. It's not much more than ash and animal fat, mixed together in a crude approximation of the cleaning agents that would eventually revolutionize hygiene. He rinses his hands quickly, not caring about the water splashing on his shoes or the fact that the soap leaves a greasy residue. The market is loud and busy, filled with the smell of raw meat, fish and freshly baked bread, all competing with the background hum of human bodies, all of them moving, all of them living their lives, just trying to get by. For some, the market is a place of opportunity. For others, it's a place where hygiene is secondary to survival. It's here that you see people bartering for scraps of cloth to clean their homes or for herbs to cover the smell of the workday. It's a scene that reminds you of how hygiene, cleanliness, or the lack of it is not just an individual affair, it's a community issue, one that binds people together in a shared struggle. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly aware of the dangers that dirt and filth posed, or whether they simply learned to live with it. There's evidence to suggest that medieval people understood that dirty water could lead to illness, but there's also plenty of evidence that they had little understanding of how disease spread. The presence of public bathhouses and the use of herbs to treat ailments suggests that they were at least partially aware that hygiene and health were connected. But without the knowledge of germs and bacteria, they had to rely on superstition, herbs, and trial and error. One thing is for certain, though, hygiene was a communal affair. Whether it was the public latrines shared by all, the communal wash basins where families bathed together, or the street corner where people gathered to wash clothes in the river, hygiene wasn't just about personal cleanliness, it was about the ways in which people interacted with one another and the world around them. In the medieval city, cleanliness might have been an impossible ideal, but survival was a daily effort, and it took every bit of resourcefulness. People had to stay one step ahead of the dirt, the disease, and the decay. You continue on your journey through the city, thinking about the ways in which hygiene shaped the medieval world. You've seen the extremes, the nobility's elaborate rituals, the peasants' resourceful improvisations, the religious ascetics' disregard for cleanliness in favor of spiritual purity. What strikes you most, though, is the resilience of it all. Despite the filth, the disease, and the lack of modern understanding, people made do. They survived. And in the end, that's perhaps the greatest lesson the medieval world has to offer us. No matter how dirty things got, they always found a way to keep moving forward. You wander deeper into the heart of the city, the streets growing quieter as you approach the outskirts. There's something peaceful about the way the world feels at night, even in the midst of all the chaos and discomfort. It's a rare stillness, the the kind you only find when the hustle of the day has finally faded and the air begins to cool. You notice the way the light from the lanterns dances across the cobblestones, casting long wavering shadows that seem to stretch and bend with every step. The medieval city is a place that thrives in contradictions, filth and beauty, luxury and squalor, health and disease. And in that tension, it's clear that hygiene isn't just about cleanliness, it's about navigating a world where the best you can hope for is survival. As you move through the quiet streets, you come to a large stone building, its arching doorways inviting you inside. This is one of the few places where hygiene might just be taken seriously, an apothecary's shop, tucked away in the shadows of the city's ancient walls. You step inside, the smell of herbs and potions immediately hitting your senses. It's a calming fragrance, but one that's almost too thick to be entirely pleasant. The shelves are lined with jars, each one containing a different mix of herbs, powders and oils, all promising to cure everything from toothaches to fever to lice. The apothecary stands behind the counter, mixing together something in a mortar and pestle. He looks up as you approach, his hands steady, the flickering candlelight casting shadows over his face. Looking for something to clean up, he asks, his voice low, almost a whisper. His question isn't just about cleaning in the way we understand it, it's about managing the constant presence of disease, pestilence and dirt that follows people around in this world. You explain that you're curious about the ways in which people deal with cleanliness in a world that doesn't have soap, running water, or modern medicines. The apothecary gives a slow nod, as though this question is one he's heard 1,000 times before. It's a tricky business, you know, he says. Everyone has their own remedies. Some work, some don't. The key is knowing what will give you a fighting chance. You watch as he reaches for a jar of ground rosemary and a bundle of dried lavender. He mixes them into a small cloth pouch and hands it to you. A simple remedy for keeping the pests away. Rosemary keeps lice off and lavender will help you sleep better. Not much, but it's better than nothing. You take the small bundle, grateful for the insight. The apothecary's shop is a place of quiet refuge in a city that's always on the edge of chaos. Here people come for answers to questions they can't ask anywhere else. They come for hope, for solutions that don't rely on money, status, or access to the latest luxuries. In a world where cleanliness is always a battle, the apothecary's remedies are a lifeline, offering a glimpse into the small subtle ways people tried to clean their lives without the tools we have today. In the medieval world, hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was about what worked. And sometimes, what worked was as simple as a handful of herbs, a quiet routine, and the willingness to adapt to the world around you. You leave the apothecary's shop with a small bundle in your hand, and as you step back out into the cool night, you realize that cleanliness in this world is more about resourcefulness than perfection. People may not have had the luxury of modern hygiene, but they had the tools they needed to survive. As you walk away, you can't help but reflect on what you've learned. The medieval world was a place where hygiene was often a matter of life and death, but it wasn't something that could be easily solved with modern methods. Instead, it was something that had to be lived with, something that required ingenuity and adaptability. People in the medieval world didn't have access to soap or antiseptics, but they found ways to manage their hygiene through herbs, natural remedies and community. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood the dangers of filth and disease. Some believe they had a basic understanding of hygiene and its connection to health, while others suggest they were unaware of the link between dirt and sickness. Either way, the fact remains that they did their best with what they had. And in the end, that's what made the medieval world so resilient, its ability to adapt, to make do, and to survive in a world that was often unkind. You continue on your way, feeling a sense of quiet awe for the people who lived in this world. The struggles they faced, the discomforts they endured, they were just like you, just trying to find a way to make it through the day.
And though their methods of hygiene may seem foreign, strange, or even absurd by modern standards, they were doing what they had to do to survive. And in that there is something profoundly human. The city fades into the distance behind you as you head toward your next destination. The world of medieval hygiene may have been grimy, uncomfortable, and even at times unthinkable, but it was a world built on survival, and that survival is something that still resonates in the world we live in today. As you leave the apothecary behind, the city begins to feel more and more like an intricate maze, each corner, each alley, holding secrets of survival, resilience, and discomfort. The night air is crisp now, and you find yourself in a quieter part of the city, a place where the grandeur of the noblemen's estates and the hustle of the market fade into the shadows. This is where the real medieval world hides, not the flashy displays of wealth or the sanitized rituals of the church, but the gritty reality of everyday life for those who lived on the edge of survival. You pass by a small tavern, the low murmur of conversation and clinking of tankards spilling out into the street. It's one of the rare places where the common folk gather, where the boundaries of class and wealth seem to disappear, if only for a few hours. Here there's no pretension, no polished airs. The people who gather here are weary, the kind of people who have fought through every day just to make it to the next. And as you look around, you see that hygiene is less of an afterthought than it is a distant dream. Inside, the smells are as much a part of the experience as the food and drink. A mix of roasting meat, bitter ale, and the unmistakable scent of sweat and musk fills the air. It's not unpleasant, but it's not clean either. The tables are rough-hewn, the floors dusty, and the air thick with smoke from the fire in the hearth. People sit close, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes their personal miseries. There's a comfort in the way the tavern exists, a kind of acceptance of the conditions that most people in the medieval world simply had to endure. You sit at a table near the fire, joining a group of workers who've just finished their shift. They look worn out, their clothes heavy with the day's labor. The conversation is light-hearted, punctuated by bursts of laughter, but there's an undercurrent of exhaustion that you can't ignore. One man, his face rough and tanned from years of hard work, leans over to speak to you. Cleanliness, he chuckles. I suppose we all try, but it's more about surviving than anything. I scrub when I can, use whatever water I can get. But honestly, the best we can do is make sure we don't get sick, don't pick up lice or worse. It's a statement that rings true. The medieval world wasn't about living pristinely, it was about surviving. And when hygiene was a luxury few could afford, people made do with what they had. Whether it was a handful of herbs for cleaning, a quick dip in a cold river, or a ritual wash with soap made from animal fat, survival was the common thread that held the world together. You notice the way the workers' hands are stained with dirt and calluses from years of physical labor. But there's a pride in that. They may not be able to afford soap, but their strength, their resilience, is their hygiene. Historians still debate the role of hygiene in the lives of the medieval lower classes. Did they understand the link between cleanliness and health, or were they simply resigned to their fate? Some argue that they had their own systems in place, using herbs, oils, and even ash as cleaning agents. Others suggest that they were unaware of the dangers of poor hygiene, and that illness and disease were just part of life. Either way, it's clear that hygiene wasn't a one-size-fits-all practice. It was a system that adapted to the realities of life, and for most people, that meant finding creative ways to manage cleanliness when the resources simply weren't there. As the conversation continues, the group begins to swap remedies for lice, for sore muscles, and for the aches that come from a long day of work. You hear stories of people who had been saved by a humble herbal poultice, or a surprisingly effective remedy made from animal fat and ash. It's a world where survival depends on knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that's often unrefined, but effective nonetheless. The tavern grows louder as the night wears on. The workers continue to drink and laugh, their worries momentarily forgotten in the warmth of the fire and the camaraderie of the group. You can't help but admire their resilience, their ability to survive in a world where cleanliness wasn't a given, where disease and discomfort were a constant threat, yet they still found joy in the small things, the warmth of the fire, the companionship of friends, and the occasional respite from the daily grind. As you sit back and listen to the stories unfold, you realize that hygiene in the medieval world wasn't just about the tools you had, it was about the mindset you carried. For the common folk, cleanliness wasn't a luxury to be sought after, it was a matter of survival. You made do with what you had, and you adapted. You couldn't always control your surroundings, but you could control how you dealt with them. And in that control, there was power. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene practices contributed to the spread of disease, or helped to stave it off. Some say that the lack of sanitation and the constant exposure to filth made medieval people more susceptible to illness, while others suggest that their reliance on natural remedies and communal efforts to manage hygiene may have been more effective than we give credit for. Either way, it's clear that the medieval world was a place where survival was a daily challenge, and hygiene was a crucial part of that struggle. As the night winds down, and you prepare to leave the tavern, you feel a sense of quiet reflection settle over you. The medieval world may not have been clean, but it was full of resilience, full of people who did the best they could with what they had. And in a way, that's what hygiene was really about, finding ways to survive in a world that was constantly testing your limits. You step out into the cool night air, the sounds of the tavern fading behind you, and you realize that despite the dirt, the discomfort, and the challenges, the medieval world was a place where people still managed to live. They found ways to clean themselves, to protect themselves, and to keep going. And maybe, in that struggle for survival, there's something we can learn from them today. You walk through the city's dim streets, the cold night air brushing your skin as the sounds of the tavern fade behind you. The medieval world, so full of contrasts, seems to be slowly unraveling as you move deeper into the heart of it. Here in the darkness, you realize something about the people who lived in this time, for all the discomfort, all the suffering. There was a certain ingenuity that kept them going, a survival instinct that pushed them to adapt, to make do, and to find ways to exist in a world where hygiene was far from a priority. You find yourself near the outer walls of the city now, the buildings thinning out as you approach the fields and farmlands that surround it. The smell of the earth, the animals, and the crops fills your nose, a welcome change from the stifling, sour air of the city. This is where the real struggle takes place, the heart of the medieval world, where hygiene and survival are tied not to the comfort of lavish estates or grand public bathhouses, but to the land itself. It's here in the fields, where people have to rely on the most basic, unrefined methods of cleaning, protecting themselves from disease, and staying healthy. As you walk past a small farmhouse, you notice the flickering light of an oil lamp through the window. You can hear the faint murmur of voices inside, a family gathered at the end of another long day. You stop for a moment, watching through the window as the family eats their humble meal, passing around bowls of porridge and vegetables. Their home is simple, nothing extravagant, no fine tapestries or ornate furniture. But what catches your attention is the way they manage their hygiene in such a small, confined space. Inside, the family has clearly made use of what little they have. The floors are swept, the windowsill is lined with small pots of herbs, and the room is lit by the soft glow of the lamp. The mother is carefully cleaning her children's hands with a damp cloth, while the father grinds herbs between two stones, preparing a salve for a sore joint. It's not much, but it's all they have. And it's enough. The medieval rural life was one of resourcefulness. People didn't have access to the luxury of modern sanitation or the endless supply of water that we take for granted today. They had to make do with what they could find, often using natural resources like herbs, ash and animal fats to clean themselves and their homes. In many ways, the rural poor were cleaner than the city, simply because they were more in tune with the natural world around them. They knew the properties of plants, the benefits of different kinds of mud, and the ways to use the land to their advantage. It's here that you realize something fundamental about medieval hygiene. It wasn't just about cleanliness in the modern sense, it was about survival. People had to know how to deal with the grime, the pests, and the constant threat of disease. In the absence of modern medicine and sanitation, their hygiene practices were deeply tied to their ability to stay alive. In rural areas, people often used the land itself as a resource. Herbs like rosemary, lavender and thyme were used to ward off pests, while clay and mud were applied to the skin to absorb oils and dirt. They understood the importance of keeping lice and fleas at bay, and their methods, though crude by today's standards, were effective in a world where cleanliness wasn't a given. For the rural poor, hygiene wasn't about luxury or appearance. It was about staying healthy, avoiding disease, and doing whatever they could to keep the pests and sicknesses at bay. Historians still debate how much people in medieval rural areas understood about the spread of disease. Some argue that the constant exposure to dirt and filth made rural populations more susceptible to illness, while others suggest that their connection to the land, their knowledge of natural remedies, and their reliance on community hygiene practices helped them survive in ways that city dwellers couldn't. Either way, what's clear is that rural hygiene was a matter of practicality and survival, not luxury. It was about making the most of what nature provided. As you watch the family inside the farmhouse, you see the mother applying the salve to her child's skin, soothing a small cut with a mixture of herbs and animal fat. She does it gently, with a practiced hand, as if this small act of care is as essential to their survival as the food they eat or the shelter they have. You wonder how many generations of families have passed down this knowledge, the knowledge of how to survive, how to manage the dirt and the disease, and how to make do in a world that doesn't always offer the luxury of cleanliness.
As you continue down the road, the moon shining overhead, you think back to everything you've seen, the grand estates of the nobles, the humble cottages of the poor, the bustling market, and the quiet, resourceful families of the countryside. They all shared one thing in common: they were all living in a world that, for all its messiness and discomfort, was a world of survival. The medieval world was one of filth and disease, yes, but it was also one of resilience and ingenuity. The people who lived in it may not have had the luxuries we enjoy today, but they found ways to thrive, to live, and to make the best of their circumstances. Historians still argue about the nature of medieval hygiene, whether people were aware of the dangers of filth, whether they understood the importance of cleanliness, or whether they were simply trying to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world. But one thing is clear: they adapted. They made do with what they had. And in the end, it was that adaptability, that ability to endure, that allowed them to survive in a world where hygiene was a luxury few could afford. You step away from the farmhouse, heading back toward the city, the sounds of the night surrounding you. The medieval world may have been dirty, uncomfortable, and at times downright grim, but it was also a world full of people who knew how to survive, how to adapt, and how to keep going, even when cleanliness seemed out of reach. The first light of dawn begins to break through the night, casting a pale glow over the sleeping city. You stand at the edge of the city now, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretches out before you, the fields, the rivers, the distant forests. It's a scene of simplicity, untouched by the complicated layers of urban life. Here, in the quiet of the countryside, the medieval world seems to slow down. The rhythms of the earth are unbroken by the clang of blacksmiths, the chatter of merchants, or the hustle of peasants in the city. In a way, this is the world as it was before the complications of urban living set in, and it's in this quiet that you realize the full complexity of hygiene in the medieval world. Out here in the rural areas, life is rooted in survival, and hygiene takes on a different form. The people who live here don't have the luxury of public baths, perfumed oils, or imported soap. Instead, they rely on the natural world around them. The river, the forest, the earth itself, these are the things that shape their approach to cleanliness. Their daily rituals are simple but effective, rooted in centuries of trial and error. The wisdom they carry is passed down through generations, a form of hygiene that's as much about knowledge as it is about necessity. You watch as a farmer walks down a dirt path, his hands rough and calloused from years of working the land. His clothes are worn, faded from constant use, but there's something about the way he moves, careful, deliberate, that shows he's accustomed to this life. He stops by a stream and begins to wash his hands in the cool water, scrubbing away the dirt of the day's work. The water is clear, flowing steadily over the rocks, but even here you notice the simple rituals of cleanliness that take place. He dips a cloth in the water and wipes his face, the process slow, almost meditative. There's no soap, no lather, just water and the quiet sounds of the river. This is a world where cleanliness is simple, elemental, and tied to the very land itself. You can't help but think of the city, where hygiene was a constant battle against the dirt and the disease that seemed to lurk around every corner. In the city, the wealthy could afford to bathe in perfumed water, to rely on servants to wash their clothes, to even pay for someone to clean their chamber pots. But here in the countryside, things are different. People make do with what they have, relying on the land, the water and the resources they can find to stay clean. They may not have access to luxury, but they have something far more practical, resourcefulness. Historians still argue whether rural people were healthier than their urban counterparts, despite the lack of modern hygiene methods. Some argue that rural people had the advantage of cleaner air, less crowding, and a stronger connection to nature, which helped them avoid the diseases that ravaged urban centers. Others claim that the close living conditions of rural life, where people shared homes with animals and were exposed to dirt and waste more frequently, made them just as vulnerable to illness as city dwellers. Either way, one thing is clear: hygiene in the countryside was deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. The people here weren't concerned with the luxury of a bath, or the fragrance of imported perfumes. They were concerned with staying healthy, and their knowledge of natural remedies and simple cleaning practices was a vital part of that effort. You walk along the stream, the sound of the water flowing beside you, and you realize that hygiene, in its most basic form, is a practice of balance. It's not about perfection, it's about doing what you can with what you have, and it's about understanding the world around you, the herbs that can heal, the water that can cleanse, the earth that can absorb the dirt. In the rural medieval world, cleanliness wasn't something that could be purchased or obtained through luxury. It was something earned through knowledge, effort, and a deep connection to the land. As you continue walking, you spot a family gathering firewood by the edge of the forest. They're not wealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they move with purpose, their work deliberate. The children are helping, collecting twigs and smaller branches, while the father works at the larger logs. The air smells faintly of pine and earth, and there's something satisfying about the simplicity of it all. This family's hygiene isn't defined by fancy remedies or expensive treatments, it's defined by the way they live, by their connection to the earth and the resources it provides. The fire they gather will not only provide warmth, but also a place to cook, to purify water, and to ward off the pests that might otherwise invade their home. As the day fully breaks, you watch the sun rise over the hills. The city seems far away now, a place of noise, complexity and luxury. But out here, in the fields, it's clear that hygiene isn't about luxury at all. It's about survival, resilience, and a deep understanding of the world around you. People here aren't concerned with perfumes or polished rituals, they're concerned with staying clean enough to stay healthy, to stay alive. And in that world, that's all that really matters. You leave the rural village behind, walking back toward the city, but something has shifted inside you. The medieval world, with all its filth, discomfort, and lack of modern hygiene, was also a world of ingenuity, of people who adapted to their surroundings, who made do with what they had, and who fought to survive in the face of constant challenges. Whether they were rich or poor, urban or rural, medieval people were united by the struggle for cleanliness, a struggle that in the end was as much about survival as it was about hygiene. Historians still debate whether medieval hygiene practices were effective or simply ineffective. Some argue that the lack of sanitation and understanding of disease led to a high mortality rate, while others suggest that the adaptation to their environment helped them survive in ways that we often overlook. Either way, one thing is clear: hygiene in the medieval world was less about perfection and more about persistence, about doing what you could to stay healthy in a world that offered few guarantees. As you walk back toward the city, you feel a quiet sense of gratitude for the knowledge you've gained. The medieval world may have been dirty, uncomfortable, and at times cruel, but it was also a world of survival. And in that struggle, there's something we can all learn from the people who lived and thrived, despite the odds. As you near the city again, the morning sun fully spilling over the horizon, the world around you begins to come alive. The medieval city, though filthy and chaotic in so many ways, has an undeniable pulse. People are already bustling through the streets, carrying baskets of goods, pushing carts, and setting up the day's market stalls. The sounds of merchants haggling, children shouting, and animals calling blend together in a harmonious, noisy symphony. But underneath all of this activity, you can't help but feel the weight of what you've learned. Hygiene in the medieval world was a constant struggle. It wasn't something easily achieved, and for most people, it was more about survival than it was about perfection. You walk into the center of the city, past the grander houses of the noblemen and the lesser dwellings of the tradespeople. Even here, in the most public spaces, cleanliness isn't guaranteed. The city streets are narrow and winding, and the filth that accumulates in the gutters is impossible to ignore. You catch sight of a group of children running past, laughing as they play, but even their clothes are stained, and their faces smudged with dirt. This, you realize, is the norm for them. It's not something they think about, not something they can change. The grime is simply part of their lives. It's in the contrast between the different classes that the true depth of medieval hygiene practices becomes clear. The rich, who have access to perfumes, imported soap, and private bathing rooms, may appear cleaner on the surface. But the reality is that they too live in a world where the streets are filthy, where the water is contaminated, and where disease is a constant threat. Hygiene for the rich may have been a matter of appearance, but even they couldn't escape the reality of a world without modern sanitation. You glance toward a bustling market stall where a merchant is offering fresh vegetables. He grins as he notices you looking, but it's impossible to ignore the grimy hands he's using to sort through the produce. In the medieval world, personal cleanliness wasn't something that could be easily controlled. It was a product of the environment, a system that favored survival over comfort, ingenuity over sanitation. The merchant hands you an apple, dirt clinging to its skin. He offers a cheerful smile, but the apple's rough, unpolished surface is a stark reminder that hygiene, in this world, is as much about perception as it is about practical survival. You take the apple, and before biting into it, you glance around. There's a well nearby, but you have no idea how clean its water is. Still, you wipe the apple against your sleeve and take a cautious bite. It's gritty, but fresh. A reminder that even in a world of filth, life finds a way to be fruitful. Historians continue to debate the connection between hygiene and disease in the medieval world. Some suggest that the constant exposure to filth and the lack of proper sanitation led to the spread of deadly diseases, such as the Black Death. Others argue that despite the apparent lack of hygiene, medieval people found ways to survive, relying on natural remedies, common sense, and a close-knit community to stay healthy. Either way, what's clear is that hygiene in the medieval world was not something that could be easily separated from life itself. It was part of the fabric of everyday existence, woven into the routines of survival, adaptation, and endurance. As you walk through the market, the city bustling around you, you realize that in many ways, hygiene was just one more challenge medieval people faced. And yet, they persisted. The people of the medieval world didn't have access to the modern conveniences that we take for granted today. They didn't have clean running water, efficient sewage systems, or antibiotics. What they had, though, was resilience. The kind of resilience that comes from living in a world where survival is not a given, where every day presents a new challenge to overcome. You move past the market, now more aware of the dirt underfoot, the smells in the air, and the crowded, bustling city around you. It's clear that hygiene, for medieval people, wasn't a matter of luxury. It was about doing the best they could with what they had. It wasn't about perfection, it was about making do, improvising and adapting. People in the medieval world didn't have the luxury of modern standards of cleanliness, but they found ways to live within the constraints of their time, finding solutions where they could and enduring the rest. You continue walking through the city, heading toward the edge, where the town gives way to the fields and the open countryside. Here, in this final stretch, you can see the stark contrast between the bustling streets of the city and the quieter, more peaceful rhythm of rural life. The countryside, with its slower pace, its reliance on nature for survival, offers a different kind of hygiene, a hygiene rooted in the land, in simplicity, and in the understanding of what it means to live within your means. Historians still debate the role of cleanliness in the lives of medieval people. Some argue that the lack of sanitation and hygiene contributed to the high mortality rates, while others claim that the medieval world was more resilient than we give it credit for. Either way, what stands out is the creativity, the resourcefulness, and the sheer determination of those who lived during this time. They didn't have the luxuries we take for granted, but they found ways to survive and thrive. Hygiene for them was less about perfection and more about resilience. As you walk away from the city and head back into the countryside, you take one last look at the medieval world you've just walked through. It was a world of filth, yes, but also a world of survival, ingenuity, and adaptation. And in that world, hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was about living in a way that made sense for the time, about finding what worked, and about holding on to hope in a world that didn't always offer it. As you leave the familiar sights of the city behind, the landscape before you begins to feel open, vast and far simpler than the complex, often claustrophobic world of medieval urban life. You find yourself walking down a worn dirt path, the rhythm of your footsteps blending with the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustling of the wind through the trees. The air here is different, fresher, somehow, as though the earth itself breathes more easily away from the crowds and filth of the city. The further you walk, the more you realize just how much hygiene in the medieval world was shaped by the land itself. In the countryside, cleanliness isn't a luxury, it's more of a necessity, a survival skill that comes with an intimate knowledge of nature and the resources it offers. For the people who live out here, hygiene isn't about wealth or status, it's about using what you have at hand to protect yourself, to keep your family safe from disease, and to do your best to stay clean in a world where water is scarce, soap is a rarity, and disease is an ever-present threat. You pass a small farm, where a family is gathered around a wooden table outside their home. They're not wealthy, not by any means, but there's a sense of peace in the way they go about their day. The children play with a ball of twine in the dirt, their clothes dusty but unbothered, while the parents work together to prepare a simple meal from the vegetables they've grown in their garden. The smell of freshly baked bread fills the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the soil. It's a grounded, simple existence, where the most important thing isn't wealth or status, but survival and community. You watch them for a while, noticing the way they move in harmony with the land around them. The family's daily routine involves cleaning and washing with water drawn from the well, a practice that's efficient, if not luxurious. In this rural world, water isn't wasted. The same water used to wash clothes is also used to water the garden or to feed the animals. There's an inherent practicality to everything, a sense that each action, no matter how small, serves a greater purpose. There's no room for extravagance here, no room for wasted resources. Hygiene in this world is about making do with what you have, and doing so in a way that ensures survival, not just cleanliness.
Historians still debate whether the rural poor had better hygiene than their urban counterparts, given their closer relationship to the natural world. Some argue that rural communities, with their access to fresh air, open spaces, and better food sources, may have had fewer health problems than those living in crowded, unsanitary cities. Others claim that the close quarters of rural homes, where families lived alongside animals and waste was often disposed of in open pits, made rural life just as prone to disease as urban centers. Either way, the rural lifestyle, though full of its own challenges, was in many ways more directly tied to the land and its resources. Hygiene here was less about fancy rituals and more about using what you had at hand to stay alive. You watch as the mother of the household takes a handful of herbs and begins to rub them between her fingers, releasing their natural oils and fragrances. She carefully boils the herbs in a pot of water, turning it into a simple homemade soap for washing. There's no expensive fragrance, no fancy ingredients, just rosemary, thyme and lavender, which she's grown herself. This is a common practice in rural areas, using what the land provides to create simple, effective cleaning solutions. The mother offers you a small jar of the herbal soap as a gift, and you're struck by how much care she's put into something as simple as this. It's clear that for her, cleanliness is more than just about getting rid of dirt. It's about survival, maintaining health and living in harmony with the. As you continue walking, you think back to the city. In the hustle and bustle of urban life, hygiene was tied to wealth and status. The rich had access to perfumes, baths and servants to do their bidding, while the poor had to make do with whatever they could find. But here, in the countryside, hygiene is more about practicality. The people who live here don't have the luxury of multiple sets of clothes, or the ability to buy expensive perfumes. But what they do have is a deep connection to the land, a knowledge passed down through generations about how to make use of the natural world to clean, protect and survive. You reach a small stream. Its water trickling over smooth rocks. The sound is soothing, and you pause for a moment to take it all in. Here in this rural setting, water is sacred. It's not just a means of cleaning, it's a lifeline, a vital resource that sustains life in a world where everything else seems uncertain. The water here is used for washing, cooking and drinking, but it's also something to be respected. People don't waste it, and they certainly don't take it for granted. It's in this simplicity that you see the true resilience of the medieval world. The people who lived here didn't have the modern conveniences we take for granted today, but they made do. They adapted to their environment, used what they had, and found ways to keep themselves clean, healthy, and connected to the world around them. Hygiene in the medieval world wasn't about perfection, it was about survival. It was about knowing how to use nature to your advantage, about finding ways to stay clean and healthy, in a world where that was never a given. Historians still debate the role of hygiene in the medieval world, but what stands out most is the ability of people to adapt. They didn't have the tools we have, the knowledge we have, but they survived, through knowledge passed down, through resilience, and through a deep understanding of their environment. Whether in the crowded city or the quiet countryside, medieval people managed to live in a world where hygiene wasn't a luxury, but a daily struggle. You stand by the stream for a while longer, the quiet of the countryside washing over you, and as you turn to leave, heading back toward the city, you realize that despite everything, the dirt, the disease, the discomfort, there's something beautiful in the resilience of the people who lived here. They didn't have the conveniences we enjoy today, but they found ways to survive, to adapt, and to live in harmony with the world around them. And maybe that's the true story of medieval hygiene. Not perfection, but persistence. As you leave the tranquility of the countryside behind, you step back into the city with a heavy heart, the weight of what you've learned lingering in your thoughts. The medieval world was a complex and often uncomfortable place, where survival was the priority, and hygiene was more about adaptation than perfection. The people who lived during this time didn't have the conveniences we take for granted today, but they made do with what they had. They found ways to stay clean, healthy, and resilient, even in a world full of dirt, disease, and discomfort. The contrast between the urban and rural worlds of the medieval period is striking. In the countryside, hygiene was shaped by the natural world, simple, practical, and deeply connected to the earth. People had to make use of herbs, water, and whatever resources they could find to protect themselves from illness. In the city, hygiene was a luxury, a sign of wealth and status. The rich could afford to indulge in elaborate bathing rituals, perfume, and servants to care for their needs. But despite all the outward appearances of cleanliness, the urban world was full of its own challenges: public latrine, polluted water, and a constant battle against disease. As you walk through the city once more, the crowds of people seem more alive than ever. The market is bustling, vendors shouting their wares, the clinking of coins, the chatter of neighbors. The air smells like a mix of fresh bread, fish, and the undeniable scent of human life, sweat, dirt, and the sweat of animals. It's a smell that's become part of the fabric of the city, something everyone who lives here has learned to ignore, to live with. You catch sight of a child running through the crowd, their face streaked with dirt, their clothes just as muddy as the streets they're racing across. It's a reminder that in this world cleanliness is a luxury, not a given. You find yourself at the edge of a square, where a group of peasants are gathering, murmuring amongst themselves. They're chatting about the latest outbreak of illness in the neighboring town, speculating on where it came from, and who might be next. A few of them carry bundles of herbs, perhaps for a remedy, perhaps for protection. You overhear one woman saying that she's going to the apothecary to get something for the fever, which in this time could mean anything from a common cold to the dreaded plague. You can't help but wonder if these people understand the true nature of hygiene. That it's not just about cleanliness, but about understanding disease, avoiding contamination, and taking the proper steps to protect themselves. You overhear an older man talking about the last time he bathed, about 2 weeks ago, he says with a shrug. It's an ordinary conversation in a world where public bathhouses have long since lost their appeal. In the cities, the idea of frequent bathing is a rare luxury, a treat for the wealthy or the lucky few. For most it's a matter of practicality, once a month or so, maybe, if the weather's right and there's a public bathhouse nearby. In this world, soap is expensive and water is often contaminated. Hygiene is less about routine and more about survival. There's a strange kind of resilience here in the city. People walk past the filth, the smells, the decay. They carry on, day after day, finding ways to survive, to make do with what they have. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood the spread of disease. Whether they knew about germs, or whether they simply accepted that illness was a part of life. Some argue that they had some understanding of how sickness spread, while others suggest that they were more concerned with the visible signs of illness, fever, boils, and death, than with the invisible dangers that lurked in the dirt and water. As you continue walking through the square, you pass by a merchant selling what seems like ordinary bread. But as you look closer, you notice that some of the loaves are oddly shaped, their crusts darker than usual. It's not the quality of the bread that catches your attention, it's the way it's being handled. The merchant is wiping his hands on his apron, but there's no water or soap, no cleaning materials in sight. This is the reality of medieval hygiene. Even something as simple as food is handled without regard for cleanliness, without the knowledge we have today about foodborne illness or contamination. People eat what they can, when they can, with little regard for what may be lurking in the bread or the meat they buy from the butcher. The reality is that hygiene in the medieval world wasn't about perfection. It was about making do with what you had, about living in a world where sickness was inevitable, but survival wasn't guaranteed. Hygiene wasn't something that could be easily separated from everyday life. It was a daily struggle, a constant balancing act between the filth and the need for survival. As you head back into the bustling heart of the city, you find yourself thinking about the medieval people you've encountered in your journey. The workers in the tavern, the farmers in the countryside, the nobles in their grand estates, they all shared one thing in common. They were trying to survive in a world that didn't offer much in the way of comfort. They fought against the elements, against disease, and against the daily reality of living in a time when hygiene was a constant challenge. And in that fight, they found their own solutions, whether that was a handful of herbs, a quick rinse in the river, or a visit to the local apothecary. They didn't have the luxury of modern sanitation or understanding, but they found a way to make it work. You look around one last time as you walk deeper into the city. The hustle, the bustle, the dirt, it's all part of the same world. The medieval world was messy, uncomfortable, and full of contradictions, but it was also a world of resilience, adaptation, and survival. Hygiene wasn't about perfection, it was about doing the best you could with what you had. And in that there's a kind of beauty, a quiet strength that carries on through history, even if the dirt and disease are long gone. Historians still argue about medieval hygiene. Whether it was effective, whether it contributed to the spread of disease, or whether the people of that time simply adapted to their circumstances. What's clear is that the medieval world was a place where survival came first, and hygiene was just one part of that struggle. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in a way that's all any of us can ask for. The sun dips lower in the sky as you find your way through the city once more, the shadows growing long as the final hour of the day settles in. The medieval world, for all its grime and discomforts, still carries a pulse, one that beats through the cobbled streets, the bustling markets, the hum of voices in every square and alley. Yet despite the bustling life around you, there is a lingering thought that sits uneasily. Hygiene, cleanliness, these are not simply matters of luxury or vanity, but rather crucial parts of a daily battle against the invisible, unspoken threats that plagued the medieval world.
As night falls, you can't help but think back to the families, the merchants, the workers, and even the nobility, all struggling in their own way with the realities of hygiene. For most, it wasn't about beauty, nor was it about the comfort of a warm bath or clean sheets. Hygiene was survival, something that had to be managed amidst the chaos, the dirt, and the harsh realities of life. The most basic form of cleanliness was often all that could be hoped for: a quick scrub with water, a handful of herbs, a simple cloth rubbed over the face to clear away the grime of the day. In some ways, this is the most striking feature of medieval hygiene. It wasn't about the things we typically think of when we imagine cleanliness today. It wasn't about soft towels or scented soaps, or even the luxury of a daily bath. Instead, it was about finding ways to endure, to navigate a world that was messy, dangerous, and often unforgiving. The medieval world wasn't particularly concerned with being spotless, it was more concerned with the basic struggle for health and survival. And so, every day, people lived with the discomfort of filth, the weight of the invisible threats around them, yet they did so with resilience, with grit, and with the kind of creativity that allowed them to make the best of a difficult situation. As you wander deeper into the heart of the city, the night fully settling in, you find yourself at a local gathering place, a tavern where the firelight flickers through the windows, casting warm light onto the street. Inside, the atmosphere is relaxed, the noise of chatter and laughter filling the air. There's a sense of comfort here, a sense of escape from the ever-present realities of the medieval world. Yet, even in this setting, the reality of hygiene is never far from view. The tavern, though filled with warmth and merriment, is still subject to the same limitations that plague every other part of the city. The floor is covered in dirt, the walls damp with condensation, and the smell of ale, sweat, and smoke lingers in the air. You join a table where a group of workers has gathered, the noise of the crowd rising and falling in rhythm with their conversation. The man next to you leans in, offering you a mug of ale. You get used to it, he says, nodding toward the noise in the crowd, the dirt, the smell. It's just part of living here. In the city you can't avoid it. You wash when you can, but that's about it. His words are matter of fact, like a man who has lived in this world long enough to understand that perfection was never on the table. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene was truly as bad as we imagine, or if people simply had a different concept of cleanliness. Some argue that the city's squalor, its overcrowding, and its lack of proper sanitation contributed directly to the spread of disease and illness, while others believed that medieval people were just as capable of managing their hygiene as they could. What's clear is that no matter what, hygiene wasn't something most people could focus on in the way we do today. They didn't have the resources to worry about their pores, their teeth, or their perfectly pressed clothes. Instead, they were simply trying to survive the day, and survive it as best they could. The evening wears on, and the conversation shifts to stories of sickness and survival. One man tells a tale of how he once had a fever so bad, he was sure it would take him. But he survived, he says, because of his mother's herbs, mint, thyme, and garlic, boiled into a concoction that according to her would chase the sickness away. It's a tale that resonates with the people in the tavern, each of them having their own remedies, their own ways of coping with the realities of medieval hygiene and health. It's a world where diseases spread quickly, where illness was just as likely to kill as any sword, and where survival depended not just on luck, but on knowledge passed down through generations. The stories wind down, and the tavern grows quieter. You reflect on what you've seen, what you've learned. The medieval world was grimy, yes, but it was also a world of ingenuity and adaptation. It was a world where people, despite the lack of modern sanitation and hygiene, found ways to survive. They didn't have the luxuries we take for granted, but they had resilience, they had creativity, and in the end, that's what allowed them to endure. As you prepare to leave, you take a moment to look around at the faces in the tavern. There's an unspoken understanding here, an understanding that hygiene, in this world, was not about perfection. It was about making do with what you had, about using your knowledge and resources to stay healthy, to fight the inevitable dirt, and to survive. And that, you realize, is perhaps the greatest lesson of the medieval world, that even in the face of disease, discomfort and filth, people found ways to thrive, to adapt, and to live. Historians may still debate the specifics of medieval hygiene, but you now understand something fundamental. The medieval world was built on resilience, and hygiene, as imperfect as it was a part of that survival. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about doing the best you could, with what you had, in a world that didn't offer much. As you leave the tavern behind and step out into the cool night air, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance, you realize that the medieval world, for all its messiness, was a world where people made do, where they found solutions, and where they survived against all odds. And in that survival, there's a kind of beauty, a beauty that survives, even today, in the resilience and ingenuity of those who came before us. The streets are quieter now, the city's hustle fading, as the sounds of the night settle into a deep, hushed rhythm. You stroll through the stillness, the dim light of the street lamps casting shadows on the buildings around you. As you make your way back to the heart of the medieval world, you can't shake the thought that lingers in your mind, how the world, despite its dirt, disease and discomfort, managed to survive. The medieval people who lived through this world didn't have our modern comforts, our access to soap or clean water, but they made it work. They adapted, they endured, and they found ways to keep living. As you continue your walk through the city, you pass by a group of children who are playing in the street. They're barefoot, their faces streaked with dirt, but they laugh and run through the streets as though it's the most natural thing in the world. The medieval world wasn't just about survival, it was about finding moments of joy and comfort, even in the harshest of circumstances. These children may have grown up in a world that lacked the hygiene standards we have today, but they knew how to play, how to laugh, and how to find happiness in the smallest of things. You watch as the children run past, their laughter echoing in the streets, and you realize that, despite all the discomfort and filth, there was something profoundly human about this time. It was a world of hardship, of disease and of struggle, but it was also a world of resilience, creativity, and the ability to find joy in even the darkest of times. Historians still argue about the role of hygiene in the medieval world, but what stands out most is how people managed to live in a world that wasn't kind to their bodies. The struggle for cleanliness was a constant, but it wasn't just about getting clean. It was about survival, about finding ways to stay healthy, and about doing the best with what you had. Whether they were wealthy or poor, rural or urban, medieval people had to navigate a world of dirt, disease and discomfort, and in that world hygiene was less about luxury and more about survival. As you move deeper into the city, the sounds of the market begin to fade, replaced by the quieter hum of the night. The city, now bathed in moonlight, feels almost like a different place. The streets are less crowded, the air cooler, and you can almost imagine the medieval world as a place of stillness, where people went about their daily lives with a kind of quiet determination. The problems of hygiene, disease and discomfort were ever present, but so was the quiet resilience of the people who lived through it. The more you reflect on it, the more you realize that hygiene in the medieval world wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about the will to survive. People lived in a time when survival was often more about resilience and resourcefulness than about anything else. The people who lived in the medieval world didn't have our modern knowledge or the tools to keep themselves perfectly clean, but they did the best they could. They made do with what they had, they adapted to the world around them, and they survived. You find yourself standing at the city's edge once more, looking out over the rolling hills that surround the city. The land is quiet now, a deep calm settling over the fields and forests. The medieval world, with all its noise, dirt and struggle, feels distant here. And yet, as you look out over the land, you realize that it's this world, this struggle for survival, that shaped the very people who lived through it. Hygiene wasn't about perfection, it was about survival. And it was this survival that allowed the medieval world to endure, to adapt, and to find ways to live in a world that didn't offer much in the way of comfort. As you look out over the land, you can't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for those who lived in the medieval world. They didn't have the advantages we enjoy today. No clean water, no soap, no antibiotics, but they survived. They found ways to live in a world that was constantly trying to bring them down, and in that there's something profoundly inspiring. Historians continue to study the medieval world, searching for answers about how hygiene played a role in the survival of its people. Some say that it was the ingenuity of medieval people that allowed them to survive, while others argue that their lack of knowledge about germs and disease led to the spread of illness. Either way, what's clear is that hygiene was a constant challenge, and yet the people of the medieval world found ways to live. They found ways to endure, to fight, and to survive in a world that didn't offer much in the way of comfort or luxury. As you turn back toward the city, you feel a quiet sense of awe. The medieval world wasn't perfect, but it was a world full of resilience, creativity, and the will to survive. And in that there's something beautiful, a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the ability to find ways to adapt, to overcome, and to live. You take one last look at the city as it fades into the distance, knowing that the story of hygiene in the medieval world is far from over. It's a story of survival, of struggle, and of resilience, and it's one that continues to shape the way we think about cleanliness, health and survival today. As the glow of the city recedes behind you, leaving only the whispers of its noise and life in the distance, you realize just how deeply the medieval struggle for hygiene intertwined with daily existence. You've wandered through narrow alleyways, watched people make do with their surroundings, and learned that cleanliness in the medieval world wasn't just a concept, it was a constant, unyielding battle. For those living in this time, hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was a matter of health, survival, and community. And it wasn't something anyone took for granted. The sun rises fully now, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink, and you find yourself walking along a country road, the edges of the city behind you. The scent of fresh earth fills your lungs, the air clean and crisp, a far cry from the fetid, crowded streets of the medieval cities. Here in the quiet calm of nature, the simplicity of rural hygiene becomes even clearer. The countryside is a place where survival hinges on the most basic of actions, finding clean water, avoiding pests, and managing the daily struggle against dirt and disease.
But there's something pure in this simplicity, something untainted by the complexity of city life. You pass a small group of farmers gathering hay, their clothes caked in the dust of the earth. They work in silence, a quiet solidarity in their movements as they prepare for the day. Unlike the bustling city market, there are no loud voices, no hurried steps, no confusion of people jostling for space. Here the world feels grounded, as though the pace of life is slower, more deliberate. You stop to watch them for a while, noticing how each of them moves with purpose and rhythm. Their lives are hard, no doubt. But here hygiene isn't a luxury, it's an ongoing process. It's about washing the hands with water drawn from the well, about brushing dirt from the face, about using the earth's resources to stay healthy. In the rural medieval world, hygiene was practical. You would wash in a stream or well, using the resources nature provided, herbs for cleaning, water for washing, earth for absorbing dirt. But here there were no public bathhouses, no grand cleaning rituals. Life in the countryside was about getting by, doing what you could to keep the dirt from accumulating, and using the land's resources to protect yourself from disease. You watch as one farmer pauses to wipe his brow, the dirt on his face now mixed with sweat. He doesn't seem bothered by the discomfort of it all, he simply carries on, as though it's part of the daily routine. And perhaps it is. For these people, hygiene is never perfect, but it's enough. Enough to keep them healthy, enough to work the land, enough to keep disease at bay. In a world without modern medicine, without antibiotics or vaccinations, hygiene was less about cleanliness in the way we think of it today. It was about survival. In some ways the rural areas were more in tune with the cycles of nature than the city folk. They had to be. People in the cities could escape the daily discomfort of grime and dirt by paying for a bath or using perfume to mask the odors. But for those in the countryside, there was no such escape. There was no wealth to insulate them from the realities of medieval life. Their hygiene was a product of necessity, of pragmatism. In a world where illness could strike at any time, keeping clean was more about staying alive than staying fashionable. You look over at a small village in the distance, its stone houses clustered together on the horizon. It's a simple place, but it's a place where people understand how to survive. In this village, the practice of hygiene may be less sophisticated than in the city, but it's equally important. There people would make soap from animal fat, wash their clothes in the nearby river, and rely on herbs and water to keep themselves clean. Their routines weren't about luxury, they were about survival, about making do in a world that didn't always offer comfort. Historians still debate whether the rural poor in the medieval world were healthier than those in the city. Some say they had the advantage of cleaner air, better food, and less exposure to the diseases that ran rampant in crowded urban centers. Others claim that rural life was just as dangerous as life in the city, with disease spreading through small communities as easily as it did in the crowded streets. Either way, it's clear that hygiene was an ongoing battle, one that people in both the city and the countryside had to fight daily. You continue walking, the sun warming your back as you take in the quiet beauty of the landscape. As you pass through a small wood, you reflect on how little has changed in the way we think about hygiene. In many ways, the battle for cleanliness is still just as much about survival as it was in the medieval world. Today we have the luxury of modern conveniences, of sanitation systems and water treatment plants. But even in the modern age, hygiene is still about keeping ourselves healthy, preventing disease, and adapting to the world around us. The medieval world was a world of survival. The people who lived through it didn't have access to the knowledge or the tools we have today, but they adapted. They found ways to clean, to stay healthy, and to survive in a world that was constantly trying to bring them down. And in that adaptation, there is something deeply admirable. As you emerge from the wood and see the village in the distance, you realize that the medieval world was a world not of perfection, but of resilience. It wasn't about being perfectly clean. It was about doing the best you could with what you had, and in the end that's what allowed the medieval people to survive, to thrive, even in the face of filth and disease. It was about the will to adapt, to make do, and to keep living. As you approach the village, the landscape shifts once more. The rolling hills, the deep greens of the fields, and the distant sound of a dog barking seem to wash away the city's grime and bustle. The air is fresher here, and the small cottages that dot the landscape appear worn, yet sturdy, built from the earth, made to last. The people here, you realize, live in a world where hygiene isn't about maintaining a facade of cleanliness, but about practicality, about surviving with what the land offers. This is the place where medieval hygiene took its most humble form. You see women hanging freshly laundered clothing on lines, their clothes stained by the dirt of the fields, but scrubbed as best as they can with what little they have. They take the water from a nearby well to rinse their clothes in the stream, and then let the wind dry them. There are no grandiose displays, no luxury, just the simple, everyday work that makes a life. You pause and watch the women as they go about their tasks. There's a quiet determination in their movements, a sense of purpose in everything they do. They don't have soap made from imported oils, and they certainly don't have the time or energy for baths like the nobles in the city, but they make do. They clean the earth off their skin with water and rough cloths, and they keep their homes as free from pests as they can with the limited resources available to them. It's clear that for them hygiene is not about cleanliness in the way we think of it today. It's about necessity, survival, and resourcefulness. You notice that their approach to hygiene, to cleanliness, is as much about keeping the dirt and disease away as it is about maintaining some semblance of dignity. They clean the floors of their homes with straw, replace the bedding when it gets too soiled, and make use of the herbs that grow nearby to keep the pests at bay. For these rural medieval people, hygiene is about balance, about living in harmony with the land, and using what the earth provides to protect themselves from the dangers of illness and infection. Historians still debate whether rural people in the medieval world had a better grasp on hygiene than their urban counterparts. Some suggest that the clean air, the absence of crowds, and the availability of fresh, uncontaminated water made rural life healthier. Others argue that the close proximity to animals, the lack of proper sanitation, and the constant exposure to dirt and waste made rural living just as dangerous as life in the city. Either way, it's clear that hygiene in the rural world was far from perfect, but it was effective, it was survival, and it worked. As you continue to observe the women, you see one of them reach for a bundle of herbs. She ties them together with a piece of twine, and hangs them over a low beam in the doorway, where the smoke from the hearth will help drive away the insects that threaten to infest the house. It's a simple but vital practice that has been passed down through generations. There's no fancy insect repellent, no modern tools, just herbs, fire, and the wisdom of the land. You begin to understand that the rural world of medieval hygiene wasn't about trying to be clean. It was about being smart enough to survive. The people who lived here didn't have access to the latest in medical advancements or modern sanitation systems, but they knew how to make use of the resources at their disposal. They knew how to work with the land, to adapt, to make do. Hygiene wasn't something they could hope for, it was something they fought for every day, using the simplest tools and methods at their disposal. As the sun begins to set, casting an amber glow over the fields, you realize that hygiene in the medieval world wasn't just a luxury, it was a lifeline. For the wealthy, hygiene could be a matter of status, an outward display of their riches and sophistication, but for the poor, for the people in the countryside, hygiene was about living another day, about staying healthy, and about making the most of what little they had. The village before you is a testament to that survival. There's no glamour here, no polish, but there is a kind of grace. The people of this place have learned to make the best of a harsh world, and in that they've created something that in its own way is as beautiful as any grand palace. You leave the village behind, walking back toward the city, your thoughts still lingering on the lessons of the day. The medieval world was a place where hygiene wasn't about luxury or cleanliness, as we know it today. It was about survival. It was about resilience. It was about making do with what you had, and in that there is something profoundly human. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood hygiene. Some claim they were aware of the dangers of filth, while others suggest they had no real understanding of how disease spread. But one thing is certain, the people of the medieval world found ways to survive, to stay healthy, and to make do in a world where hygiene was a constant battle. They didn't have modern conveniences, but they had something far more important: the ingenuity to adapt, the resilience to endure, and the wisdom to know how to survive. As you walk back through the city, the sounds of the streets filling your ears once more, you carry with you the quiet understanding that hygiene in the medieval world was far more complex than we often realize. It wasn't about getting clean. It was about survival. And in that, the medieval people taught us something timeless: resilience, adaptation, and the will to keep going, no matter what. The city is bustling now, the early morning light spilling through the narrow streets. As the daily life of medieval people picks up again, you find yourself walking among the crowds, observing the merchants, workers, and common folk as they start their daily routine. There's a certain rhythm to it all, the relentless march of life that never stops, no matter how uncomfortable, how grim, or how uncertain the circumstances might be. As you walk, you notice something different today. The air is thick with the smells of the marketplace, the scent of spices and bread, the sharp tang of fresh fish, and the ever-present undertone of sweat and dirt. It's not unpleasant exactly, it's just part of the world. A world where hygiene is something that everyone has to think about, whether they can afford it or not. It's inescapable. The contrast between the people you've seen in the city and the rural folk from the village you passed through is striking. In the countryside, there was a simplicity to hygiene, a natural connection to the land and the resources it provided. Here, in the city, cleanliness is still a luxury. Some of the wealthier folk stroll past you, their robes and faces covered in layers of perfume, their steps careful and measured, as if trying to avoid the dust and dirt around them. The city, for them, is a place where appearance matters just as much as survival. Yet, despite the apparent wealth of its people, it's impossible to ignore the fact that hygiene here, for all its luxuries, is still imperfect. The streets are lined with refuse, animal waste, and the inevitable puddles of water that collect after a night's rain. Even in the wealthiest quarters, the smell of the city is present, lingering, pervasive. The idea that cleanliness can be bought or achieved by wealth seems almost laughable, when you see how quickly it can be undone by the reality of a world without modern sanitation. You pass by a nobleman's estate, the lavishly decorated gates marking the entry into a space where cleanliness is carefully curated. The servants move briskly, taking care of the gardens, sweeping the courtyards, and ensuring that everything looks pristine from the outside. But you can't help but notice the contrast between the facade of cleanliness and the reality of the streets just outside the gates. Here, in the heart of the city, the people living inside these grand estates may have access to cleaner water, perfume, and frequent baths, but the world outside their gates is just as dirty and inhospitable as it ever was. As you walk further, you find yourself near the public baths, where men and women gather to cleanse themselves in the old ways. Public baths are still one of the few places where hygiene is regularly maintained, at least to some degree. The smell of warm water and soap drifts toward you, mingling with the sharp scent of the nearby market. The baths, though overcrowded, are essential for many in the city, providing a place to wash away the grime of the day. But even here, the process is far from glamorous. The water is used, the same for multiple people, and the floors are slick with soap and filth. But for the people who rely on these baths, they are an essential part of survival in a city that, despite its wealth, still struggles with sanitation. You stop for a moment, watching a group of workers emerge from the baths, their faces red from the heat. In the effort of cleaning, they laugh together, a shared camaraderie, in the midst of their discomfort. It's clear that for them, the bath is less about luxury and more about necessity. It's a chance to get clean, physically, at least for a few hours before they return to the streets, where the battle for cleanliness continues. The contrast between these public bathhouses and the wealthier households you passed earlier is striking. The rich may have access to private bathing spaces, but they are still tied to a world that is just as dirty as the one outside their gates. The lower classes, meanwhile, rely on the public baths, the shared resources, and the little rituals they've developed to survive in a world where hygiene is a constant struggle. In the end, it's not about wealth or luxury, it's about survival.
As you leave the bathhouse behind, the day stretches out before you, full of the noise and bustle of the medieval city. The streets are packed with people, merchants peddling their wares, children playing in the dirt, and workers moving swiftly from one task to the next. The city, despite its many flaws, is alive, a place where survival is key, where hygiene is a constant battle, and where the most basic of human needs often go unmet. And yet, there's something undeniably human about it all. The resilience of the people, the way they adapt to their surroundings, the ingenuity they show in making do with what they have, it's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The medieval world may have been messy, uncomfortable, and often unsanitary, but it was also a world of survival, of creativity, and of determination. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was a world that people made their way through every single day. You walk back toward the heart of the city, reflecting on the journey you've taken through this world. The medieval world wasn't just about hygiene, it was about survival, about doing what you could with what you had, about making the best of a world that offered little in the way of comfort or cleanliness. The people of the medieval world didn't have modern conveniences, but they had something even more important, the ability to survive, to adapt, and to keep going. As you walk through the streets once more, you realize that the story of medieval hygiene is in many ways the story of human resilience. It's not about perfection, it's about survival, and that perhaps is the greatest lesson the medieval world can teach us. The city has settled into the quiet hum of late afternoon, and you can feel the weariness of the day settling in. The crowds, once frantic with the bustle of the morning market, have thinned out, leaving behind the more steady rhythms of life. The faint clatter of wooden carts, the clink of metal tools, and the murmur of distant conversations all blend together, like a well-worn tune. Yet, as you walk through these now quieter streets, the reality of what you've witnessed so far becomes clearer. The medieval world, despite all its hardship and discomfort, was a world of constant innovation and persistence. In the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, disease, filth, limited resources, people did what they could to survive. They adapted, they learned, and they survived. Hygiene wasn't about perfection, it was about making it through the day. You walk past a corner of the city, where a small group of men are gathered around a wooden stall, scraping what appears to be animal pelts. The smell of tanned leather is sharp and heavy in the air, mingling with the faint, lingering scent of animal waste from the nearby market. The men work with efficiency, their hands busy with the task at hand, their faces covered in dirt and sweat. Hygiene for these workers is a luxury they can't afford. The dirt doesn't bother them, they've lived with it all their lives. Instead, they focus on the work, using every tool they have, despite the overwhelming mess. You pause, watching them for a while. It's a reminder of how the medieval world was shaped by the demands of survival. People had no choice but to get their hands dirty, to live in a world where cleanliness was more about making do than achieving perfection. Even in a world that demanded so much, there was a certain grace in the way people navigated it all. They didn't have the knowledge we have today about hygiene, but they had ingenuity, creativity, and the ability to adapt. As you continue walking, the scene in front of you shifts. You pass a row of cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys, the smell of cooking food drifting out to meet you. You can hear the faint sound of children playing in the distance, their voices rising and falling as they run and laugh in the street. The homes here are simple, small stone structures, their windows dark, their doors sturdy but unadorned. These are the homes of people who live with the land, who make use of what they have, and who understand the delicate balance between survival and cleanliness. Their hygiene is not about luxury, but about necessity. They use what the land provides to keep themselves and their families healthy. Herbs, water, ash and mud. Everything is used with care, nothing is wasted. You stop in front of one of the cottages and observe a woman gathering wood for the fire. She carries a bundle of branches in her arms, her face set in concentration. As she bends to pick up another branch, you notice the roughness of her hands, the dirt under her fingernails, and the simple worn dress she wears. This woman's life is one of constant labor. Hygiene for her is something to manage in the margins of her day. She uses the water from the well to wash her face, but there is no luxury in it. There is no time for the indulgence of cleanliness as we know it today. For her, hygiene is about making sure her family is healthy enough to continue working the land, to survive, to make it through another season. Historians still debate whether rural people in the medieval world had a better understanding of hygiene than their urban counterparts. Some suggest that the rural poor, with their access to fresh air, better food, and cleaner living conditions, were healthier. Others argue that rural communities were just as susceptible to disease and infection as those living in the city, given the close quarters in which they lived, their reliance on animals, and their lack of proper sanitation. Either way, it's clear that rural hygiene was a matter of practicality. There were no grand bathhouses, no public latrines, just the basic practices of survival, adapted to the world around them. As you leave the cottage behind and walk down the road, you begin to think about everything you've seen. The nobility's perfumes, the city's public baths, the rural families using herbs and water to wash their faces. Each of these is a response to the same basic challenge: how to survive in a world that doesn't offer modern comforts, where dirt, disease and discomfort are constant companions. The medieval world may have been filthy, but it was also a world of incredible resourcefulness. People didn't have the luxury of perfect hygiene, but they found ways to adapt, to survive, to live. The further you walk, the more you understand that the story of medieval hygiene is not just about dirt and disease, it's about resilience. It's about people who, despite living in a time of limited knowledge and resources, managed to carve out lives for themselves, to survive, and to thrive. They adapted to their circumstances, using what they had at their disposal to stay healthy, to stay clean enough, and to protect their families from the dangers of illness. Historians continue to explore the role of hygiene in medieval society, whether it contributed to the spread of disease, whether it helped people survive, or whether it was simply an afterthought in a world where survival was the primary concern. Some argue that the medieval world was plagued by filth and disease, while others suggest that the practices of the time were effective in their own way. What's clear is that hygiene in this world was never perfect, but it was always a vital part of daily life. Whether it was a handful of herbs, a quick dip in a cold river, or the occasional trip to a public bathhouse, people found ways to survive, and to survive with dignity. As the sun begins to set, casting a golden glow over the fields and the distant horizon, you realize that the medieval world, for all its dirt and discomfort, was a world of strength. The people who lived in it, who fought against the odds, who found ways to clean, to protect themselves, and to adapt, they are the unsung heroes of history. Hygiene may have been an ongoing struggle, but it was part of a larger battle for survival, for resilience, and for life itself. You take a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air, and for the first time in a long while, you feel a quiet sense of admiration for the people who lived in this world. They didn't have what we have today, but they had something more. They had the will to survive, to adapt, and to keep going, no matter the odds. The day has almost ended, the last light of the sun dipping below the horizon as the medieval world continues its rhythmic pulse. The street lights flicker to life, casting their dim glow over the city. You find yourself walking through quieter streets now, where the noise of merchants and market-goers fades, and the city seems to breathe more slowly, more deliberately. The medieval world, for all its chaos and discomfort, has found its rhythm, a rhythm defined by struggle, survival, and adaptation. You think back to all the places you've walked through, the contrasts you've witnessed between the crowded, smelly streets of the city and the quiet, humble farms on the outskirts. There were moments of discomfort, of dirt and disease, but there were also moments of resilience, ingenuity, and community. People in the medieval world didn't have the luxury of modern hygiene or cleanliness, but they made do. They fought back against the filth and disease that surrounded them, using the tools and knowledge they had to survive, to adapt, and to find ways to live. It's funny really, how the simplest things, the everyday acts of cleaning, washing and survival, become a reflection of a culture, of a time. You realize now that the struggle for hygiene was more than just a matter of personal comfort, it was about survival. It was about doing whatever it took to keep healthy, to avoid disease, to stay strong in a world that didn't offer much in the way of modern conveniences. For the people who lived in this time, hygiene was never just about being clean, it was about staying alive. As you walk past a small stone well, you stop for a moment, noticing how the water sparkles faintly in the dimming light. For the medieval people, water was their lifeblood. It wasn't something they could take for granted, it was something they had to work for. From collecting water from wells to filtering it through herbs or boiling it to ensure its safety, people in the medieval world did what they had to do to ensure they stayed healthy. There were no modern water treatment plants, no refrigerators, no bottled water. There were only rivers, wells, and the occasional public fountain, and those resources had to be used wisely, carefully, and conservatively. You think about the apothecary you visited earlier, with his jars of herbs and powders, each one promising to heal or protect. The medieval world, despite its lack of modern medicine, was a world of remedies, herbal treatments, poultices, and concoctions passed down through generations. People didn't have antibiotics, but they had knowledge, passed through communities, families, and villages. And while it wasn't always perfect, it worked. It kept people alive in a world where the smallest misstep could lead to sickness or death. The contrast between the rich and poor is still striking in your mind. The wealthy, with their private baths, imported perfumes and servants to take care of their every need, could afford to appear clean, to cover their bodies in fragrance and oil. They could afford the luxury of personal cleanliness. But even they weren't immune to the dirt and disease that lingered in the world around them. The poor, on the other hand, didn't have that luxury. They didn't have the access to clean water, the perfumes, or the comfort of privacy. But they made do, relying on natural remedies, communal efforts, and a deep understanding of the land and its resources. It's in this contrast that you find the heart of medieval hygiene, the struggle for survival that transcended class, wealth, and status. The rich could afford to appear clean, but they were no less vulnerable to the dangers of disease. The poor could afford no luxury, but they had resourcefulness and the knowledge of how to survive in a world that didn't offer comfort. As you leave the city's heart behind and find your way back toward the quieter outskirts, you reflect on the people you've encountered, the workers, the farmers, the merchants and the nobles. All of them, in their own way, fought the same battle. They were all part of a world that didn't offer much in terms of hygiene, but they found ways to live, to adapt, and to survive. Whether they used herbs to clean their skin, water from the well to wash their clothes, or perfume to mask the smells of the city, they all found ways to cope. They did what they had to do to survive, to stay healthy, and to keep going. Historians continue to argue about the details of medieval hygiene, whether the people of the time understood the importance of cleanliness, whether they were aware of how disease spread, or whether they were simply trying to live in a world that was far more dangerous than we can imagine. But one thing is certain, the medieval world was a world of survival, of resilience, and of ingenuity. The people of that time didn't have our modern conveniences, but they had something far more important, the ability to adapt, to make do with what they had, and to survive. As you make your way out of the city and back toward the countryside, the night air cools around you, the sounds of the city fading into the distance.
You realize that the story of hygiene in the medieval world isn't just about filth and disease, it's about survival. It's about the people who lived through it, who adapted to their circumstances, and who found ways to thrive, even in a world that didn't offer much in the way of comfort or cleanliness. You take one last look at the city, the glow of the lanterns flickering in the distance. The medieval world may not have been clean by our standards, but it was a world that survived, and in that survival, there's a beauty that comes from the resilience of the human spirit, the will to adapt, and the determination to keep going, no matter the odds. Sweet dreams.